There is a place in the American interior where the earth opens up in ways that nobody fully understood until recently. Not a cave worn smooth by water over 10,000 years, not a natural fissure in the limestone, not a sinkhole or a collapse zone, or any of the other features that geologists have been cataloguing since the first survey crews pushed into the backcountry with their compasses and their notebooks. This is something different, something that sits beneath some of the oldest mining districts in North America and refuses to behave the way it is supposed to behave. Something that the new scans found by accident, while looking for something else entirely, and that nobody in the room that day was prepared to explain. The people who work in subsurface mapping do not startle easily. They spend their careers looking at data that resolves the underground world into colored gradients and density readings and depth signatures, and they get very good at reading what they see. Bedrock looks one way, collapsed mine shaft looks another, water table looks another, glacial till, decomposed granite, old spoil heap material, intrusive igneous dike. All of these things have signatures. All of them are recognizable to anyone who has spent enough time with the equipment. And so when the signatures came back from the surveys conducted in the older mining territories of the American interior, the people reading them knew almost immediately that what they were looking at did not fit any of the categories they had been trained to recognize. The tunnels were too regular. The spacing was too deliberate. The depth profiles did not match anything that colonial era or industrial era mining would have left behind. And the orientation of the passages followed a geometry that made no sense if you were trying to extract ore, but made a different kind of sense if you were trying to do something else. Something that the people who built these passages had in mind long before anyone from Europe had ever heard the word America. There is something about the deep past, about the layers of time pressing down beneath the ordinary surface of things, that settles the mind in a particular way. It reminds you that the questions worth asking are not always the ones that get answered quickly, and that the most interesting chapters of any story are sometimes the ones that were buried longest. Someone in Minnesota at midnight. Someone in New Mexico watching the stars. Someone in Virginia lying in the dark with the window cracked. All of us circling the same mystery together from whatever corner of this continent we happen to occupy tonight. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. We need to go back before the scans. We need to go back before the mining districts themselves, before the prospectors and the assay offices and the claim stakes driven into hillsides by men who had walked for weeks to get there. We need to go back to a time when North America was a continent full of people who had been engineering the landscape for thousands of years, who had developed sophisticated relationships with stone and earth and underground space, and whose works the subsequent centuries did an extraordinarily thorough job of obscuring, not always deliberately. Sometimes, the obscuring happened through simple passage of time, through the slow accumulation of forest duff and river silt, and the patient work of weathering. Sometimes it happened because later inhabitants built directly on top of earlier ones, and the older layers sank below the zone of easy visibility. And sometimes, in ways that are less comfortable to think about, it happened because people in positions of authority decided that a simpler story was more convenient than a complicated one. The complicated story is the one the scans are beginning to tell. And it starts not with a dramatic discovery in a single location, but with a pattern that researchers started noticing when they began comparing subsurface data from multiple sites across a region that stretches from the upper Great Lakes down through the Ohio River Valley and across into parts of the Central Appalachians. Different surveys, conducted at different times by different teams with different objectives, kept returning data that shared a family resemblance. Tunnels at consistent depths, tunnels with consistent profiles, tunnels that seemed, when you plotted them on a map and drew the lines out to see where they led, to form networks rather than isolated passages. And networks, in the language of engineering, imply purpose. They imply planning. They imply someone who looked at a landscape from a perspective broad enough to think in terms of routes rather than simply locations. The oldest mines in North America that European settlers ever documented were not the first mines on the continent. This is one of those facts that tends to get mentioned in footnotes and then quietly set aside, because following it seriously leads somewhere that mainstream narratives about pre-Columbian North America have traditionally been reluctant to go. The copper mines of the Lake Superior region, some of them, were ancient beyond any reasonable interpretation of the word ancient. When the first European explorers and missionaries reached the upper Great Lakes in the 17th century, they found Ojibwe and other indigenous people who knew exactly where the copper was, who used it, who traded it across distances that would have seemed implausible if the archaeological record did not confirm them, and who had oral traditions about the copper that reached back into a time so remote it had no beginning that anyone could name. The missionaries wrote this down, the fur traders noted it, and then, over the following centuries, the documentation got buried under everything else that was happening, and the deeper implications of what the indigenous informants had actually been saying got lost in translation, sometimes literally. What those informants were saying, if you read the earliest accounts carefully and with attention to what is actually being described rather than what the person doing the writing expected to hear, is that the copper had been worked for a very long time, that there had been people before, that the mines themselves, some of them, were not things that anyone living had made, that the shafts and the pits and the channeling works were already old when the traditions that the Ojibwe and the Menominee and the Potawatomi maintained had first taken notice of them. They were speaking, in other words, about an inheritance rather than a creation. They were describing a landscape that had already been shaped by human hands and human intelligence before their own ancestors had arrived in it, or before their own ancestors had begun the traditions that were old enough for anyone to remember their origin. Archaeology eventually caught up with this, at least partially. By the 20th century, researchers working in the Lake Superior Basin had documented evidence of copper extraction that dated back not hundreds but thousands of years. The Old Copper Complex, as archaeologists came to call it, represented a tradition of copper working that appears in the archaeological record beginning somewhere around 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, and continuing with varying intensity for several thousand years thereafter. The people of the Old Copper Complex made tools and objects from native copper that appear across an enormous swath of eastern North America, moving through exchange networks whose extent the trade goods themselves reveal. A copper awl found in Ohio, a copper spear point in Indiana, copper ornaments in burial mounds from Illinois down to the Gulf Coast. All of it tracing back, when you follow the metallurgical signatures, to the Lake Superior Basin and the peculiar geological gift that left pure copper sitting in nodules and sheets and masses in the rocks of that region, ready to be worked cold by people who understood exactly what to do with it. But here is where the story takes a turn that the standard accounts of the Old Copper Complex do not always fully grapple with. The extraction of copper from the Lake Superior region on the scale, implied by the archaeological record of its distribution across half a continent, was not a casual or small-scale operation. It was extensive. The pits and trenches that survive on Isle Royale and on the Keweenaw Peninsula and at other extraction sites in the region represent an enormous amount of organized labor over a very long period of time. The amounts of copper involved, when you try to work backwards from the archaeological distribution to estimate how much material must have been extracted and worked, are not small. And the question of where all of that extraction happened, the question of what the full extent of the workings looked like in their original state, is one that archaeology has never been entirely able to answer using surface evidence alone, because the surface evidence is incomplete, because a great deal of what was done in the Lake Superior copper territory was done underground, and underground, the evidence behaves differently than it does on the surface. It waits, it preserves, and it hides. The new scans did not begin with a theory about pre-Columbian mining. They began with a much more practical concern. The older metal mining districts of the American interior have been producing subsurface mapping data for decades, mostly in service of understanding what the old colonial and industrial mines had left behind. Abandoned shafts, flooded workings, areas of potential ground instability. The question of what is down there, and whether it is stable enough to build on or safe enough to work near. These are the practical engineering questions that drive most subsurface survey work, and they are entirely reasonable questions given that some of these old mining districts sit beneath towns and roads and infrastructure that somebody needs to worry about. The surveys were not looking for ancient tunnels, they were looking for modern hazards, and what they found, layered beneath the colonial era and industrial era workings, sitting at depths and in configurations that the documented history of mining in those areas did not account for, was something that the survey teams were not equipped to explain, and that they flagged in their reports with language that was careful and hedged, and quietly extraordinary. The language matters here. When subsurface mapping produces results that do not fit the expected profile, the people writing the report have choices about how to describe what they are seeing. They can call it an anomaly, which is the most neutral option and the one least likely to attract attention from people who are not geologists. They can speculate about natural causes, collapsed voids, karst features, old stream channels filled with material of different density than the surrounding rock. They can note the discrepancy and recommend further investigation without committing to any interpretation. This is exactly what happened in several of the reports that have come out of the older mining territories over the last 15 years or so, and it is partly why the pattern took as long as it did to be recognized, because each individual report was describing its anomalies in isolation, in the language of practical engineering caution, without any framework for understanding what the anomalies might collectively mean. The framework came from an unexpected direction, as it often does. A researcher who had been working on a project related to indigenous land use and pre-contact landscape modification in the Great Lakes region was reviewing old survey reports as part of a broader literature search and started noticing the language, started pulling on the thread of the anomalies, started asking, what if these are not anomalies in the sense of geological oddities, but anomalies in the sense of human-made features that the surveys were not designed to find and therefore do not know how to classify? What if the reason the subsurface profiles in these old mining districts do not match expectations is not because something unexpected happened to the geology, but because something unexpected happened to the people and then got forgotten? That question opened a door, not immediately and not without resistance, because the intersection of subsurface engineering data and pre-Columbian archaeology is a genuinely unusual place to be working, and the people who are expert in one field are rarely expert in the other. But the question opened a door, and once enough people with the right combinations of expertise started walking through it and looking at the same data together, what they saw was a pattern that was difficult to dismiss. Not proof, not yet, and perhaps not ever in the clean, decisive sense that popular accounts of scientific discovery tend to suggest, but a pattern, a convergence of signatures across multiple sites that pointed, with more consistency than chance could comfortably explain, toward a network of tunnels and passages in the bedrock beneath the oldest mining districts of the American interior that predated any mining that anyone had previously thought to look for there. Think about what it means to build a tunnel network underground. Think about the engineering requirements, the planning, the knowledge of geology that you need before you can do it successfully. You need to understand how rock behaves when you remove material from it, which kinds of stone will hold a roof and which will collapse, where you are likely to encounter water, how air will move through confined spaces, how to keep people working underground alive and functional. This is not intuitive knowledge. This is accumulated knowledge, the product of a long learning curve worked out by people who made mistakes and learned from them and passed the lessons on to the next generation of people doing the same work. The presence of tunnel networks in the subsurface record of the American interior implies not just labor but expertise, not just organization but a tradition of underground engineering that had been developed over a long enough period of time to produce practitioners who were very good at it. And here's the thing about traditions of underground engineering in pre-Columbian North America. The textbook version of that subject, the version that most people encounter if they encounter it at all, tends to be thin. It tends to gesture toward the obvious cases, the cliff dwellings of the Southwest, the pit houses of the Columbia Plateau, the earthworks of the Midwest, and then move on to other topics. What it tends not to do, what the field has historically been reluctant to do for a complicated set of reasons involving politics and funding and the sociology of academic disciplines, is take seriously the possibility that the underground engineering traditions of pre-Columbian North America were extensive and sophisticated in ways that the surface record alone is not capable of revealing. The surface record is what we built the standard accounts from. The subsurface record is what the scans are now beginning to reveal. And the two records do not tell the same story. Let us talk about what underground space meant to the people who inhabited this continent before European contact. Not in a vague spiritual sense, though the spiritual dimensions of underground space in indigenous cosmologies across North America are genuinely rich and deserve their own careful attention. But in a practical, material sense, underground space offered things that above-ground space could not offer: stable temperature, protection from weather, protection from certain kinds of predation, concealment, and most relevantly for understanding the mining-related tunnels, direct access to subsurface resources, whether those resources were water or mineral deposits, or simply the structural advantage of a space that human hands had carved out of the living rock for purposes that suited the people who made it. The copper, as we have already established, was the primary mineral resource that drew extraction activity to the Lake Superior region for thousands of years. But copper was not the only thing that was being extracted from the ground in pre-Columbian North America. Galena, a lead ore that was used across an enormous range of the continent for ceremonial pigment, appears in the archaeological record in quantities that imply organized extraction. Chert and flint, essential for stone tool technology, were quarried from specific geological formations that people traveled to from considerable distances. Pipestone, the distinctive red stone used for sacred objects, was worked from quarries in what is now Minnesota that have clearly been visited and worked for a very long time. The practice of going underground to get things that were underground was not exotic or unusual in pre-Columbian North America. What may have been unusual, what the new scans are suggesting was unusual, was the scale and the systematic organization of some of the underground works that remain to be fully characterized. Scale and systematic organization are exactly the things that are hardest to see from the surface. You can walk across a landscape and see individual pits, individual trenches, individual areas of disturbed soil. You can estimate the extent of surface works by their footprint and make reasonable guesses about the labor they represent. What you cannot do, walking across a landscape, is understand the three-dimensional structure of what lies beneath it, the relationships between different passages, the architecture of a system rather than the footprint of isolated features. This is what the scans provide. Not perfectly, not with the resolution of direct excavation, but with enough fidelity to see shapes and patterns and relationships that are invisible from the surface. And the shapes and patterns and relationships that the scans are revealing in the old mining territories are shapes and patterns and relationships that look, to the people who know how to read this kind of data, like the remnants of a planned and executed underground infrastructure. Infrastructure is a word that carries weight. It implies permanence, investment, collective benefit, maintenance over time. Roads are infrastructure. Irrigation systems are infrastructure. The great earthwork complexes of the Midwest, the ones that archaeologists have been documenting and debating for a century and a half, are infrastructure, elaborate and large-scale modifications of the landscape in service of purposes that were important enough to the people who built them to justify the enormous investment of labor they required. The tunnel networks beneath the old mining districts, if the interpretation being advanced by the researchers who have been working with the scan data holds up, represent a different kind of infrastructure, an underground infrastructure, but infrastructure nonetheless. Passages that served purposes, routes that connected locations, a below-ground system built to support activities that mattered enough to the people who built it that they invested in making it systematic rather than simply digging wherever the material happened to be. The question of who built it is the one that everybody immediately wants to ask, and it is also the question that is hardest to answer with the evidence currently available. The scans tell you that something is down there. They tell you approximately what shape it is, and how deep it sits, and how it relates to the geological features around it. They do not tell you who made it or when or why, not directly. Those questions have to be approached through a combination of archaeological context, oral tradition, comparative analysis, with documented pre-Columbian engineering traditions, and the difficult interpretive work of matching what the scans show to what the broader historical and archaeological record suggests about who was doing what in this part of the continent and when. That work is ongoing. It is contested in some of its conclusions, and it is producing results that keep revising the picture in ways that none of the people doing the revising fully anticipated when they started. One thing that the comparative analysis keeps returning to is the relationship between the tunnel network signatures and the known archaeological presence of what researchers call middle woodland and late woodland cultural complexes in the region. The woodland period in North American archaeology is a broad term, covering a long span of time and an enormous geographic range, roughly from around 3,000 years ago to somewhere between 1 and 2,000 years ago, depending on where you are and what criteria you are using to define the period. The woodland peoples of the Great Lakes region and the Ohio River Valley left behind some of the most striking and puzzling earthworks in the world. The Hopewell culture, which flourished in the Ohio River Valley roughly between 2,000 and 1,600 years ago, built geometric enclosures of a scale and precision that still raise questions about how they were achieved. The Newark earthworks in Ohio enclose an area of more than 4 square miles. The Great Serpent Mound in the same state stretches for over a quarter mile in an effigy form that encodes astronomical alignments that required precise observation and calculation to build correctly. These people were not casually engineering their landscape. They were doing it with intention and sophistication. And they were connected, through the Hopewell interaction sphere, as archaeologists call it, to a trade network that drew materials from across an extraordinary range of the continent. Obsidian from Yellowstone, copper from Lake Superior, mica from the southern Appalachians, shark teeth from the Gulf Coast. All of these materials appear in Hopewell burial contexts in the Ohio River Valley, and all of them imply logistical networks of a complexity and geographic extent that are easy to underestimate when you are focused on the individual objects rather than the systems that moved them. The tunnel networks, or at least the portions of the tunnel networks that sit at depths and in geological contexts consistent with woodland period activity, may represent the underground infrastructure of those logistical networks. Not roads in the above-ground sense, but something conceptually analogous. Routes through which material could move, passages through which people could work, connections between extraction sites and processing sites and storage sites that made the whole enterprise more organized and more efficient than a purely surface-based operation would have been. This is a hypothesis rather than a conclusion, but it is a hypothesis that takes seriously both the engineering sophistication of the woodland peoples and the evidence that the scans are providing, and it is a hypothesis that does a better job of accounting for all the data than any of the alternatives that do not involve pre-Columbian underground engineering on a significant scale. There is another dimension to this, that the standard archaeological literature tends to approach with caution, and that the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples most directly connected to this landscape approach, with something that looks more like matter-of-fact continuity. The underground world in the cosmological frameworks of the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley peoples was not simply a metaphorical space. It was a real space, a place that certain kinds of people knew how to access and move through, a place that had its own inhabitants and its own rules and its own significance in the larger structure of how the world worked. The below world, in the cosmological frameworks that researchers working in this area have documented, was not the opposite of the world above. It was its counterpart, its mirror, the place where certain kinds of power and certain kinds of knowledge were accessible in ways they were not accessible on the surface. We do not have to accept any particular cosmological framework as literally true to notice that this way of thinking about underground space is consistent with a practical history of underground activity. Traditions of significant underground engagement, of regular and important interaction with subsurface spaces, do not arise in cultures that have never gone underground in any meaningful way. They arise in cultures that have the specificity of the underground cosmologies of the peoples of this region, the detail with which they describe what the underground world is like and how it behaves and what kinds of things happen there, is consistent with a long history of actual underground activity rather than purely imaginative projection. The oral traditions also, in some cases, describe tunnels, not abstractly, not metaphorically, but specifically. Routes through the earth that connected places, passages that people used in particular kinds of circumstances, underground ways that were known to particular groups and that represented a kind of geographical knowledge that was considered significant enough to maintain and transmit. These descriptions are not uniform across all the traditions of the region, and they do not all describe the same things, which is actually what you would expect if different groups had knowledge of different portions of a larger network, rather than a single group having knowledge of the whole. What they collectively suggest is that the existence of significant underground passages in this part of the continent was not a secret or a surprise to the peoples who lived here. It was a feature of the landscape that they knew about and had traditions concerning, traditions that survived the disruptions of the colonial period in fragments that researchers are only now beginning to assemble into something like a coherent picture. The disruptions of the colonial period in the regions we are discussing were not small. The Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley were among the most intensely contested territories in the early history of European expansion in North America. The fur trade brought European goods and European diseases and European political entanglements into the region beginning in the 17th century. The subsequent 2 centuries brought land cessions, forced removals, the destruction of community structures, the suppression of traditional knowledge transmission, and the physical transformation of the landscape through European-style agriculture and then industrial extraction. The mining districts that later produced the subsurface survey data that the new scans are built on were themselves created through a process of dispossession, as the mineral rights to territories that had been inhabited and used by indigenous peoples for thousands of years were transferred to private and corporate interests through a combination of treaty-making and straightforward seizure. This history matters for understanding the scans and what they might mean. When the industrial miners came into these territories beginning in the 19th century and started sinking shafts and driving tunnels, they were not working in virgin ground. They were working in ground that had already been extensively worked by people who knew it much better than any newly arrived prospector. In some cases, the industrial miners explicitly noted this. Account after account from the copper country of the Lake Superior region records miners following what they called Indian diggings, old pits and trenches and surface workings that predated anything in the documented historical record, and that pointed the way to ore bodies that the earlier workers had already found. The industrial miners treated these old workings as practical guides rather than as objects of study, which is entirely understandable from a commercial standpoint and entirely unfortunate from the standpoint of the archaeological record. What the surface of the old workings preserved about who had made them and when, and how, was largely destroyed by the industrial operations that followed them. What the surface destroyed, the subsurface may preserve. This is the possibility that makes the new scans so significant. The industrial operations, as extensive as they were, operated within specific depth ranges and followed specific ore bodies. They did not, in most cases, excavate systematically at all depths across an entire district, which means that below the industrial workings, and in some cases beside them in areas that the industrial miners did not find commercially interesting, there may be features that the industrial operations left undisturbed, features that the scans are now beginning to resolve into legible form. Features that could, if the interpretation being advanced holds up, and if proper excavation work can eventually be done at the appropriate depths, yield direct archaeological evidence of pre-Columbian underground engineering in a form that would transform the standard accounts of what people were doing in this part of North America before the Europeans arrived. The challenge of actually getting to that evidence is not trivial. The depths involved in some of the most significant anomalies that the scans have identified are not depths that can be reached by conventional archaeological excavation. You cannot simply open a trench and work your way down to something sitting 40 or 60 or 80 feet below the surface in ground that has been extensively disturbed by a century and a half of industrial mining activity. You need drilling. You need careful sampling. You need a level of coordination between archaeological methodology and geotechnical engineering that is not standard practice in either field. And you need funding and institutional support and, in many cases, the involvement and consent of the indigenous communities whose ancestors built the things that the scans are showing, which is a requirement that adds layers of consultation and negotiation and relationship building to an already complicated undertaking. Some of this work is being done, quietly, carefully, in the way that genuinely consequential research tends to be done before anyone is ready to make claims that cannot be walked back. The results of the initial drilling and sampling that has been conducted at some of the scan anomaly sites are not yet fully published, but the preliminary data that has circulated in academic contexts is, by the accounts of the people who have seen it, consistent with the tunnel network hypothesis, rather than with purely geological explanations. The material coming back from depth, in some of the sample cores, includes things that do not belong in unmodified bedrock at those depths. Organic material that could, if the initial assessments hold up, yield datable carbon. Shaped surfaces where the rock has been worked in ways that differ from natural fracture patterns. Compositional differences in the fill material occupying some of the passages that are consistent with deliberate backfilling rather than natural collapse. None of this is definitive, yet. None of it has reached the point where anyone involved is prepared to stand up at a conference and say, unambiguously, that what the scans are showing is an ancient human-made tunnel network beneath the old mining districts of the American interior. The process of getting from interesting preliminary data to defensible scientific conclusion is long, and involves many steps and many opportunities for the preliminary findings to be overturned by subsequent evidence. This is how science is supposed to work, and the researchers involved are, by all accounts, committed to working through that process, rather than jumping to conclusions that the evidence does not yet fully support. But the preliminary data is interesting, and the pattern of anomalies across multiple sites is interesting, and the convergence of the scan data with what the oral traditions of the region have been saying, and with what the documentary record of the early industrial miners observed, and with what the archaeological distribution of pre-Columbian materials implies about the scale and organization of extraction and trade in this region before European contact. All of that convergence is interesting in a way that deserves more attention than it has generally received. The story that is emerging from the intersection of these different lines of evidence is not a simple story. It is not a story about a lost civilization or a forgotten race, or any of the dramatic and frequently racist narratives that have been attached to anomalous archaeological evidence in North America since the 19th century. It is a more interesting story than that. It is a story about the complexity and sophistication of the peoples who actually lived here, whose presence in this landscape was far longer and far more consequential than the standard accounts have generally acknowledged, and whose underground works may have been the foundation, quite literally, of some of the most economically important territories in the continent's later history. Let us get specific about what the scans are actually showing, because the details matter and because the details are where the story gets genuinely strange. The subsurface imaging technology that produced the data at the center of this investigation is not a single technique, but a combination of several, each of which probes the underground world in a different way and produces a different kind of information. Ground-penetrating radar, which sends electromagnetic pulses into the earth and reads the reflections that come back from boundaries between materials of different density, can resolve features at relatively shallow depths with considerable precision. Electrical resistivity tomography, which maps the way that electrical current moves through the ground and identifies zones of higher or lower resistance, can reach greater depths but with lower resolution. Seismic refraction and reflection methods, which use sound waves rather than electromagnetic energy, can resolve features at the greatest depths but require the most sophisticated processing to interpret. The surveys that produced the most significant results in the old mining territories used combinations of all of these approaches, run at different times, sometimes by different teams, and then processed together to produce composite images that are more reliable than any single technique could provide. What the composite images show, at a number of sites across the region, is a pattern of sub-horizontal passages at consistent depths below the current surface. Sub-horizontal means roughly level, not the steep downward angle you would expect from a shaft sunk to follow an ore body. The passages are roughly level or gently inclined, which is what you would expect from a tunnel designed to provide working access to a horizontal or gently dipping ore-bearing layer, or from a passage designed to move people or material horizontally from one area to another. The widths of the passages, as resolved by the imaging, are consistent with human-scale tunnels, wide enough for a person to move through, in some cases apparently wide enough for two people to pass each other. The roofs, where the imaging has enough resolution to distinguish them, show profiles consistent with deliberate shaping rather than natural fracture. Natural rock voids tend to have irregular, angular profiles reflecting the planes of weakness in the rock along which fracturing occurred. The voids the scans are showing in these locations have profiles that are more consistently arched or squared, shapes that reflect the removal of material rather than its fracturing in place. The depths vary between sites, but within individual sites, the passages tend to cluster at consistent depth horizons, which suggests they were built with reference to specific geological layers rather than simply driven wherever was convenient. In some sites, there appear to be 2 or even 3 distinct depth horizons at which passages occur, which could reflect different phases of construction at different times, or different functional purposes for passages at different depths, or simply the exploitation of multiple ore-bearing layers at different elevations in the same geological sequence. Working out which of these explanations is correct, or whether some combination of them applies, is one of the many questions that cannot be answered from the scan data alone, and that will require direct investigation of the features themselves. The orientations of the passages are another thing that the scan data can provide, and that turns out to be informative in unexpected ways. In most industrial mining, the orientation of tunnels and drifts follows the ore body. You go where the ore is, and if the ore dips to the northeast at a certain angle, your tunnels reflect that. What the scans are showing in some of the pre-colonial anomaly zones is orientations that do not follow the local ore body geometry. They follow something else. In several cases, the major passage orientations seem to reference cardinal directions with a degree of precision that is hard to attribute to chance. East-west alignments that are accurate to within a degree or two of true east-west. North-south alignments that hold their orientation over considerable distances, and, in at least one site that has been studied more intensively than the others, a set of diagonal passages whose orientations correspond to the azimuths of significant astronomical events, the rising and setting points of the sun at the solstices, the rising point of certain bright stars, alignments that are present in the above-ground architecture of multiple documented woodland period sites in the region, and that, if they are present underground as well, suggest that the same conceptual framework that organized surface construction was also organizing subsurface construction. This is not as surprising as it might initially seem. The relationship between astronomical knowledge and engineering in pre-Columbian North America is well documented in the surface record. The Great Serpent Mound, which we mentioned earlier, is oriented to the summer solstice sunset. The Newark earthworks incorporate geometric forms that encode both astronomical alignments and mathematical relationships between the sizes of different enclosures. Cahokia, the great urban center of the Mississippian period, had a circle of wooden posts, called Woodhenge by archaeologists, that served as a solar calendar with an accuracy that a competent astronomer would not be embarrassed by. These people knew the sky. They built their knowledge of the sky into their works. If they were also building underground, there is no particular reason to think they would not apply the same framework to their underground works that they applied to their surface ones. The idea that astronomical knowledge would be relevant to underground engineering might seem counterintuitive. What does the position of the sun have to do with a tunnel in the bedrock? But the answer may be less mysterious than it appears. Astronomical alignments in pre-Columbian architecture serve multiple functions, some of which are practically useful and some of which are primarily ceremonial or cosmological. On the practical side, an east-west passage that you can orient by sighting along a star or the rising sun is a passage whose direction you can verify and communicate to others using information that is universally available rather than depending on instrumental measurement. On the ceremonial side, passages oriented to cosmologically significant directions are passages that participate in the same symbolic system as the rest of the built environment, which may have been important to the people who built them for reasons that were as compelling to them as the practical reasons were. The two motivations are not mutually exclusive, and in cultures where the practical and the symbolic tend to be more integrated than they are in the framework most modern Western observers bring to interpretation, they may be largely inseparable. There are places in this investigation where the personal and the political become impossible to separate from the scientific, and this is one of them. The interpretation of pre-Columbian underground works in the American interior is not a purely academic question. It touches directly on the histories and identities of the indigenous peoples whose ancestors built these works, on the legal and political questions of land rights and resource access, on the ongoing debates about how accurately the standard historical narratives of North America represent what actually happened here and to whom. The researchers who are most seriously engaged with the scan data are, for the most part, aware of these dimensions and are actively working to involve indigenous knowledge holders and tribal governments in the process of interpretation. This is not simply politically correct gesture-making, it is methodologically important, because the oral traditions and the living knowledge of the peoples most directly connected to these landscapes are genuine sources of evidence that the scan data alone cannot provide. When elders from the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Menominee nations have been consulted about the tunnel network hypothesis, the responses have been varied and in some cases illuminating. Some elders have declined to discuss the matter publicly, which is their right, and which reflects the legitimate concern that sharing certain kinds of knowledge in certain kinds of contexts can cause harm to that knowledge and to the communities that hold it. Others have been willing to indicate that the broad contours of the hypothesis are consistent with things that are known in their traditions, that the existence of significant underground works in the territory in question is not a surprise to people with access to the deepest layers of their community's historical memory. A few have been willing to describe specific features of underground passages in ways that correspond to what the scan data shows in particular locations, which is the kind of correspondence that is difficult to attribute to coincidence and that suggests the oral traditions are preserving genuine geographical information rather than purely symbolic or mythological content. The methodological challenge of working with oral tradition as evidence is real and should not be minimized. Oral traditions change over time. They are shaped by the needs and circumstances of the communities that maintain them. They are subject to the same kinds of distortion and loss that affect any system of knowledge transmission that relies on human memory rather than material record. None of this means they are unreliable, but it does mean that the relationship between an oral tradition and the historical reality it may be preserving is rarely straightforward and always requires careful analysis rather than simple equation. The researchers working with both the scan data and the oral traditions are, in the best cases, approaching this challenge with appropriate nuance, treating the oral traditions as evidence that constrains and informs interpretation without treating them as transparent windows onto a recoverable past. What the oral traditions do particularly well, in the cases where researchers have been able to work with them carefully, is provide context and framework. They tell you what the underground spaces meant to the people who used them, and why they were important, and how they related to the rest of life and practice in those communities. This kind of contextual information is precisely what the scan data cannot provide on its own. The scans tell you that something is down there. The oral traditions, at their best, tell you something about what that something was for. The combination of the two kinds of evidence, the technological and the traditional, is more powerful than either one alone, and it is pointing toward an understanding of the underground works that is richer and more interesting than either a purely technical or a purely cultural analysis could produce. Let us think about what it would have been like to use these passages, to be a person, 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago, who had reason to go underground in these territories and who knew the network well enough to navigate it. The underground world is disorienting to people who are not familiar with it in ways that go beyond the simple fact of darkness. The absence of external reference points, the way sound behaves differently in confined rock passages, the way temperature is constant and the normal cues for time of day are absent, the particular quality of air in enclosed underground spaces, all of these things create an experience that is genuinely different from surface experience in ways that have practical implications for navigation and cognition. People who work underground regularly develop a different kind of spatial awareness than people who do not, an ability to orient themselves using internal cues rather than external ones, an understanding of underground topology that is built up from direct experience rather than visual map reading. The people who built and used the tunnel networks would have had this kind of underground competence as a matter of course. They would have known the passages the way a person knows the streets of a neighborhood they have walked every day for years. Not because they had memorized a map, but because the knowledge was embodied, stored in muscle memory and spatial intuition developed through repeated practice. Teaching this knowledge to younger practitioners, transmitting the underground geography of the network from one generation to the next, would have required the kind of direct apprenticeship experience that characterizes the transmission of all high-stakes practical knowledge in pre-literate societies. You learn to navigate underground space by going underground with someone who already knows it, and by doing it enough times that you internalize the knowledge rather than simply being told it. The copper that the Lake Superior region produced, and that the network of extraction sites across the region brought to the surface and distributed across the continent, was not simply a material resource. It was a socially significant material, one whose presence in burial contexts across hundreds of miles of eastern North America signals that it had meaning beyond its practical properties. Copper objects appear in some of the most elaborate burials that the woodland period has produced, associated with individuals whose burial goods suggest high status or special social roles. The copper was not just traded, it was curated, treated with a care and intentionality that implies it was regarded as something more than simply a useful metal. Some researchers have characterized it as a kind of condensed social value, a material that accumulated and transmitted the relationships and histories of the people who handled it and passed it on. If the copper carried this kind of social weight, then the places where it came from would have carried weight too. The extraction sites, the underground passages through which access to the copper was gained, the routes by which it moved through the landscape, all of these would have been significant locations in a geography that was as much social and ceremonial as it was practical. The people who controlled access to significant locations in pre-Columbian North America, the people who had the knowledge and authority to move through spaces that others could not enter, occupied positions of power in their communities. Shamans and priests and healers in the traditions of the region have access to knowledge and to spaces that others do not. And this access is part of what constitutes their authority and their usefulness to their communities. The underground network, if the hypothesis is correct, may have been one of the spaces to which access was differentially distributed, with those who knew it most thoroughly being those who occupied particular roles in the social and ceremonial life of the communities it served. This is speculative, but it is the kind of speculation that is grounded in the anthropological and archaeological record of comparable situations elsewhere. Mines and quarries in many cultures have sacred dimensions. The Potosi silver mines in South America were understood by the peoples who worked them in terms of a conceptual framework that integrated the practical extraction of ore with a set of relationships between the miners, the mountain, and supernatural forces that the mountain embodied. The flint mines of Europe, some of which were in use for thousands of years before the societies that used them left any written record, have associated archaeological evidence of ritual activity that suggests the act of extracting flint from the earth was not purely practical, but was embedded in a set of beliefs about the appropriate relationship between humans and the enduring underground world. There is no a priori reason to think that the mining territories of pre-Columbian North America would have been different in this respect, and some specific reason, in the form of the cosmological frameworks that the oral traditions of the region preserve, to think that they would have been similar. The ore that was being extracted, predominantly copper but also other materials depending on the site, was moving through the landscape along routes that the Hopewell interaction sphere traces in remarkable detail for the region roughly between 2000 and 1600 years ago. The Hopewell network brought materials from across an enormous range of North America to the Ohio River Valley and then distributed the finished products of Hopewell craft production back out across the same network. The scale and organization of this exchange system implies a level of logistical sophistication that the standard accounts have sometimes underestimated, because the standard accounts have tended to think about the movement of material in terms of small-scale individual exchanges, rather than organized, systematic trade. But the volumes of material involved, and the geographic distances over which it moved, and the specific distribution patterns that show it arriving at particular kinds of sites rather than being randomly dispersed, all suggest something more organized than casual gift exchange. Something that required infrastructure and knowledge management and reliable routes and people whose social roles involved the maintenance and operation of those routes. The tunnel network beneath the old mining districts may have been part of that infrastructure, not the whole of it, but a key part, the underground component of a system that also had above-ground components, the earthwork sites that served as gathering places and exchange centers, the water routes that the rivers and lakes of the region provided, the overland trails that connected different parts of the network. The Hopewell system, in other words, may have been three-dimensional in a more literal sense than has generally been recognized, operating not only across the surface of the continent but also through the subsurface, using underground passages to access mineral resources and move material through terrain that was more efficiently navigated below than above. This reframing of the Hopewell interaction sphere as a three-dimensional system rather than a two-dimensional surface network is one of the more genuinely novel aspects of what the tunnel network hypothesis is proposing. It does not require abandoning any of the well-established elements of the Hopewell story. It does not require positing abilities or knowledge or social organization that the evidence does not support. What it requires is taking seriously the possibility that people who are capable of the above-ground engineering feats that the earthwork record documents were also capable of engineering underground, and that they may have had practical reasons related to the specific resources they needed and the specific geological circumstances of the region to do so. The specific geological circumstances are worth dwelling on because they are part of what makes the Lake Superior copper country and the surrounding territories so unusual and so consequential in any account of pre-Columbian North American trade. The native copper of the Lake Superior region occurs in a form that is rare enough globally to be remarkable. In most parts of the world, copper occurs in ores, chemical compounds that must be smelted at high temperatures to extract the metal. The processing requirements of sulfide copper ore, for instance, involve not only high-temperature smelting, but also specific techniques for handling the sulfur that the ore releases during processing. These are non-trivial requirements. They imply a developed pyrotechnological tradition, kilns or furnaces capable of sustaining the necessary temperatures, and knowledge of the chemical process sufficient to carry it out reliably. Native copper, the kind that occurs in the Lake Superior region, requires none of this. It is pure metal, and it can be worked by cold hammering, by annealing and hammering, by grinding and polishing, without any smelting at all. This is why copper working in North America was developed to a sophisticated level thousands of years before anything resembling a smelting tradition appeared in the archaeological record. The material allowed it. You could pick up a nugget of native copper and start hammering it into a useful shape immediately, with no processing infrastructure required. If you had the knowledge of how copper behaves under hammering and how annealing softens it for further shaping, this knowledge was clearly present in the region from very early in the archaeological sequence, and it supported a copper-working tradition of considerable sophistication and longevity. But native copper, for all its practical advantages over ore, comes with its own extraction challenges. It does not occur in uniform seams the way some ore deposits do. It occurs in pockets and masses embedded in basaltic rock, concentrated along certain geological features related to the way the mid-continent rift system, the ancient geological event that formed the Lake Superior Basin, created the conditions for copper mineralization. Finding and extracting these pockets and masses required geological knowledge, the ability to read the rock and understand where the copper was likely to be concentrated and how to get at it efficiently. This is exactly the kind of knowledge that develops over a long period of direct engagement with a specific geological environment, and that would have been the basis for the underground engineering tradition that the tunnel network hypothesis is proposing. You learn where the copper is by looking for it. You learn how to get at the copper by digging for it. And over generations of looking and digging, the most productive looking and digging strategies get refined and transmitted, and the most knowledgeable practitioners of those strategies become the most important people in the copper extraction enterprise. The knowledge of where to dig and how to dig was a form of intellectual capital, as valuable and as carefully maintained as any other form of specialized expertise in a pre-literate society. The physical works that the digging produced, the tunnels and passages and extraction chambers that the scan data is now beginning to reveal, were the material expression of that intellectual capital, the built environment that resulted from the accumulated knowledge of generations of underground workers in one of the most mineralogically rich and geologically distinctive environments on the continent. Now let us follow the copper out of the ground and through the landscape, because the distribution of the material is itself a clue to the organization of the people who moved it. The Hopewell burial mounds of the Ohio River Valley contain copper in quantities that imply a sustained supply relationship with the Lake Superior region over a period of several hundred years. The copper arrives in the Ohio Valley in various forms: raw masses, cut blanks, worked objects at various stages of completion, and finished objects of impressive craftsmanship. The range of forms suggests that the supply chain was not simple, not just a matter of extracting raw copper and shipping it south. Different things were moving at different stages of processing, which implies that processing was happening at different points along the route, and that the route itself was organized in a way that supported stage production rather than purely raw material transfer. Some of the intermediate processing sites, the places where raw copper from Lake Superior was being worked into blanks and partially finished forms before being moved further along the supply chain, have been identified archaeologically. They tend to occur at locations that were also Hopewell interaction nodes, places where the overland and waterway routes of the broader network converged, and where exchange and craft production activities are archaeologically documented. But not all of the intermediate processing can be accounted for by the known surface sites. There is a gap in the supply chain story, a gap that the tunnel network hypothesis helps to fill by proposing that some of the processing was happening underground, at or near the extraction sites, before the material entered the above-ground portion of the distribution network. Processing copper underground, in the vicinity of the extraction sites, would have had practical advantages. It would have reduced the weight of material that needed to be transported over long distances. Carrying finished copper objects or well-formed blanks is more efficient than carrying the unworked masses in which native copper is found, because you leave the waste material behind at the extraction site rather than hauling it to a distant processing location. It would also have allowed quality control at the point of production, ensuring that the material entering the distribution network met whatever standards the network's participants expected. And it would have concentrated the most sensitive craft knowledge at the extraction sites themselves, under the direct supervision of the people most expert in working with Lake Superior copper, rather than distributing that knowledge and those workers across the length of the supply chain. All of this is plausible, and some of it is supported by evidence from the scan data in the form of signatures that may represent working areas associated with the tunnels rather than simple passages. The distinction between a tunnel and a working chamber is not always clear in the scan resolution available, but there are locations in the scan anomaly data where the profile of the underground feature is notably wider or more irregular than the passage sections, consistent with the presence of enlarged working spaces rather than simply transit corridors. Whether these wider sections represent extraction chambers, processing areas, or simply structural features of the tunnels themselves, such as junctions between different passage directions, cannot be determined from the scan data. But they are there, and they are consistent with the hypothesis that the underground works served production functions as well as transit functions. The question of how long this system was in use is one that the available evidence cannot yet answer with any precision. The scan data provides geometry, but not dates. The oral traditions provide broad temporal context, but not specific chronology. The archaeological material from the surface sites associated with the tunnel network anomalies spans several thousand years, which tells you that the landscape was in continuous use by people who had reason to engage with the underground resources over a very long period, but it does not tell you which specific period saw underground activity at the depths the scans are resolving. The drilling and sampling work that has begun at some sites may eventually provide datable material from the tunnels themselves. But that work is not yet complete, and even when it is complete, interpreting the dates in terms of the history of the tunnel system will require careful argument rather than simple reading of numbers. What the archaeological sequence of the region as a whole does allow is a broad framing of when underground activity of the scale implied by the tunnel networks would have made the most sense in terms of the organization and demands of the above-ground systems it would have been supporting. The most intensive period of the Hopewell interaction sphere, the period of peak activity at the great earthwork centers of the Ohio River Valley, and peak circulation of Lake Superior copper through the broader network, falls roughly between 2,000 and 1,600 years ago. Before that period, the old copper complex was active in the Lake Superior region from roughly 6,000 or 7,000 years ago up through perhaps 3,000 years ago, a span of time during which extraction and distribution of Lake Superior copper was ongoing, but the above-ground infrastructure of the Hopewell network had not yet developed. After the Hopewell period, the earthwork centers declined, the broad interaction network contracted, and the movement of Lake Superior copper through the landscape shifted in character, becoming less associated with the spectacular burial complex that is the Hopewell signature, and more embedded in local exchange systems. Across all three of these periods, the subsurface copper resources of the Lake Superior region were being accessed. The question is whether the underground engineering implied by the tunnel network hypothesis developed gradually across all of these periods, or whether it represents a specific phase of intensification associated with the peak organizational demands of the Hopewell period, or whether it has multiple phases reflecting different historical moments of intensified underground activity. The honest answer is that we do not yet know enough to distinguish between these possibilities, and that working out the answer will require the kind of careful, systematic, well-funded research program that does not yet fully exist for this problem. What does exist, and what is driving the current moment of heightened interest in the tunnel network question, is a convergence of new technical capability and accumulated preliminary evidence that makes the research program more feasible than it would have been even a decade ago. The subsurface imaging technologies have improved dramatically in resolution and in our ability to process and interpret the data they produce. The analytical methods available for dating and characterizing ancient materials have expanded in their sensitivity and in the range of things they can tell us from small samples. The theoretical frameworks for understanding pre-Columbian North American complexity have been refined by a generation of researchers who have pushed back against the underselling of indigenous capability that characterized so much of the earlier literature, and the relationships between researchers and indigenous communities, while still in many respects fraught with the legacies of a long history of extractive and disrespectful research practices, have in the best cases developed into something more genuinely collaborative that makes both parties more willing to invest in the hard work of investigating questions that neither could address alone. The tunnel network beneath America's oldest mines is not a simple mystery, with a simple answer waiting to be found at the end of the right investigation. It is the kind of mystery that opens onto larger questions the deeper you look into it. Questions about the organization and sophistication of pre-Columbian societies in eastern North America, about the relationship between underground space and above-ground life in the cosmological and practical frameworks of the peoples of this region, about the long and underappreciated history of human modification of the American landscape before the arrival of European colonists, and about what it means to take seriously the knowledge and experience of the peoples who have been living with and in this landscape for far longer than anyone else. These are questions worth taking the time to ask carefully and to answer carefully, with all the evidence that can be brought to bear, and with appropriate humility about the limits of what the evidence can currently tell us. There is a specific location in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that comes up repeatedly in discussions of the tunnel network anomalies, and it is worth pausing on because it illustrates something important about how this kind of investigation actually works, which is rarely as clean or dramatic as the popular version of scientific discovery suggests. The site in question sits within a township that was actively mined for copper beginning in the mid-19th century and continuing into the early 20th. The surface record of industrial mining activity there is extensive and thoroughly documented. Shaft locations, drift maps, production records going back to the original surveys of the district, all of this exists in archives and has been used by researchers working on the industrial history of the Lake Superior copper country. None of it, in its original form, suggested that anything of interest existed below the deepest industrial workings or in the areas between shafts where the ore was considered insufficient to justify extraction. The subsurface survey conducted in that township in the context of a ground stability assessment produced data that was initially interpreted as showing natural voids in the rock, possibly related to vesicular zones in the basalt, which is a rock type that naturally contains gas bubble voids from its formation as volcanic lava. Vesicular basalt is common in the Lake Superior region, and its presence complicates subsurface imaging because the natural voids it contains can produce signatures that resemble human-made underground features. The initial interpretation of the anomalies as natural voids was therefore entirely reasonable, and it is what the report said. And that would have been the end of the story if a researcher reviewing the report some years later had not noticed that the distribution of the supposed natural voids was not consistent with what you would expect from vesicular basalt. Vesicular zones in basalt are not randomly distributed, but they do not form geometrically regular patterns at consistent depths across large areas. They form in bands related to the original flow structure of the lava, and those bands follow the original topography of the lava surface, which in this region means they are inclined at the angle of the regional geological dip, which is not horizontal. The voids the survey had identified were at consistently horizontal depths, which contradicted the vesicular basalt interpretation and implied that whatever was producing the signatures was following a human logic rather than a geological one. This observation, made years after the original survey by someone who had not been involved in it and who was approaching it with different questions in mind, is typical of how genuine scientific discoveries work. The data gets collected for one purpose, interpreted through one framework, filed away, and then someone comes along later with a different framework and sees something that was in the data all along, but that the original framework was not equipped to recognize. Once the vesicular basalt interpretation was set aside and the data was reprocessed with a more open set of interpretive possibilities, the signatures resolved into something that looked considerably more regular and considerably more like engineering than the original analysis had suggested. The passages, if that is what they are, occur at two distinct depth horizons in this location, separated by roughly 20 feet of intact bedrock. The upper horizon sits approximately 40 feet below the current surface. The lower horizon sits approximately 60 feet below. At both horizons, the passages appear to run roughly parallel to each other at intervals that are too consistent to be accidental, spaced approximately 30 to 35 feet apart. and at several locations along the survey transects, there appear to be cross-connections between adjacent passages, linking them at right angles in a way that would produce a grid-like pattern underground. A grid, underground, at 2 levels, below one of the most active industrial mining sites in the history of the Lake Superior Copper Country. This is the kind of thing that makes researchers hesitate before they say it out loud, because saying it out loud invites a specific kind of response from people who are not familiar with the evidence, and who hear words like ancient tunnel grid and immediately reach for the nearest conspiracy theory to attach it to. The evidence does not support conspiracy theories. It does not support ancient lost races or alien intervention or any of the other frameworks that pseudoscientific literature has historically reached for when confronted with anomalous evidence of human capability in pre-Columbian North America. What it supports, carefully and provisionally and with appropriate uncertainty, is a much more interesting proposition: that the peoples who inhabited the Lake Superior region for thousands of years before European contact were sophisticated underground engineers who built and maintained organized extraction infrastructure at a scale that the standard accounts have not previously recognized. The grid-like pattern of the lower-level passages, if confirmed, would have a practical logic that is immediately clear to anyone who has thought about the engineering of extraction operations. When you are working a mineralized zone that has horizontal extent, you need access to that zone from multiple directions in order to work it efficiently. A single tunnel gives you access to a long, narrow area. A grid of tunnels gives you access to the full extent of the zone while minimizing the amount of rock you have to move to create the access infrastructure. The grid pattern is the efficient solution to the extraction access problem, which is why industrial mining adopted it, and why it appears in mining operations in virtually every culture that has practiced systematic underground extraction. The fact that it appears, if the interpretation is correct, in the pre-Columbian works of the Lake Superior region tells you something about the level of practical engineering optimization that the people who built these works had achieved. They solved the same problem that industrial engineers later solved, and they solved it with the same solution. The upper-level passages, sitting 20 feet above the lower grid, are harder to explain in purely extraction terms because they sit in a different geological zone, one that does not appear to be as mineralogically rich as the zone the lower passages were targeting. They may represent earlier workings that were constructed when the upper geological horizon was the primary extraction target, and that were then supplemented by deeper passages as the upper zone was worked out and attention turned to the richer lower horizon. Or they may have served a different function: ventilation, water management, transit rather than extraction. Or they may be something else entirely, something that a framework built around purely practical mining logic does not fully capture. The oral traditions of the region describe underground passages that served purposes that were not purely extractive, and the upper-level passages in this site may be a trace of those other purposes rather than of the extraction enterprise itself. Water management is worth a particular moment of attention here, because it is one of the most practically significant challenges of underground operations, and one that the people working in the Lake Superior region would have encountered immediately and continuously. The rock of the region, while generally competent, is permeable enough that underground workings quickly encounter water in most locations. Industrial mining in the Lake Superior Copper Country was perpetually fighting water, and the expense of pumping it out was one of the major cost factors that eventually made many of the mines uneconomical. Pre-industrial underground operations obviously lacked pumps, which means that water management had to be accomplished through careful engineering of drainage rather than active removal. Passages had to be inclined to allow water to drain toward sumps or toward natural drainage paths. The layout of underground workings had to take into account the hydrology of the local rock and avoid configurations that would result in flooding of the productive areas. Managing water in a complex underground system without pumps is genuinely difficult, and doing it successfully at the scale implied by the tunnel network requires sophisticated understanding of underground hydrology. The fact that the passages at this and other sites appear to have consistent slope profiles rather than being level or randomly inclined is consistent with deliberate drainage design. The fact that there appear to be systematic connections between different sections of the network may reflect the need to route water efficiently out of the productive zones, rather than simply the need to move people and material. Water management design is a form of engineering that leaves traces in the geometry of underground works, even when no other direct evidence of its presence survives. And the geometry that the scans are showing includes features that a drainage-focused interpretation can account for more readily than a purely transit or extraction-focused interpretation. This is one of the reasons why the researchers who are most deeply engaged with the tunnel network hypothesis are cautious about premature conclusions. The scan data is consistent with multiple interpretations, some of which are more dramatic and some of which are more prosaic than others, and working out which interpretation is correct will require evidence that the scans alone cannot provide. Direct access to the underground features, physical examination of the surfaces and the fill material, and the associated artifacts, if any are present, will be necessary to move from plausible hypothesis to defensible conclusion. And direct access, at the depths and in the conditions involved, is not a trivial undertaking. It is the work of years, not months, and it requires resources and permissions and collaborative relationships that do not yet exist in the form that the research requires. Meanwhile, the scan data from other sites in the region keeps adding to the picture, sometimes confirming expectations based on the earliest anomalies, and sometimes producing surprises that revise the working model in significant ways. One of the more significant surprises to emerge from sites in the Ohio River Valley, where the scan campaigns have been conducted at earthwork sites rather than at mining sites, is the suggestion that some of the largest earthwork complexes in the region may have subsurface components that are not visible from above and that have not previously been suspected. The earthworks of the Hopewell tradition are among the best documented archaeological sites in North America, having been surveyed and mapped by multiple generations of researchers beginning in the 19th century. The original surveys, conducted by Ephraim Squire and Edwin Davis and published in their landmark 1848 report on the ancient monuments of the Mississippi Valley, were remarkably thorough for their time and remain foundational documents in Hopewell archaeology. What Squire and Davis could not do, and what no one until recently has had the tools to do, is look beneath the earthworks. The surface of a Hopewell earthwork site reveals the geometry of the walls and enclosures and the positions of the mound features, but it does not reveal what lies beneath them in the ground on which they were built. And the ground on which the great Hopewell earthworks were built is, in many cases, ground that had been in use for a very long time before the earthworks were constructed. The Newark earthworks were built on a floodplain that shows evidence of earlier human activity going back several thousand years before the earthwork construction began. The fact that people had been using that location for a long time before the earthworks were built raises the question of what, if anything, they had done to the subsurface during that earlier period of use. The scan data at Newark and at a few other major Hopewell earthwork sites is preliminary and has not yet been fully processed and interpreted. But the preliminary results include anomalies that are not easily explained by the earthworks themselves or by natural features of the floodplain geology. There are signatures at depths below the earthwork construction fill that look different from the natural alluvial deposits they sit in, different in ways that are hard to attribute to sedimentary processes and that are consistent with human disturbance of the original land surface before the earthworks were built on top of it. Whether this disturbance includes tunnel features similar to what the Lake Superior Mining District scans have shown, or whether it represents something else, perhaps the remains of an earlier phase of earthwork construction that was buried under the later, more elaborate works, is not yet clear. But the suggestion that the great Hopewell earthwork centers may have a subsurface history as interesting as their surface history is one that the scan data is beginning to make impossible to ignore. This is the direction in which the investigation is moving, toward a recognition that the underground dimension of pre-Columbian North American landscape modification may be as significant as the above-ground dimension, and that the standard accounts, which have focused almost exclusively on the surface record, have systematically missed a part of the story that was there all along, waiting beneath the earth for the tools to reveal it. The waiting is one of the things that this kind of investigation does to your sense of time. When you spend time thinking about evidence from thousands of years ago, evidence that has been sitting undisturbed in the rock for all of those thousands of years, while generation after generation of people walked across the surface above it without any awareness of what lay below, you develop a different relationship to the scale of human time and human knowledge. The tunnels did not know they were waiting. They simply were, in the dark beneath the earth, preserving in their geometry the record of decisions made and knowledge held, and work done by people who lived and died and were forgotten by the written record, but whose works persisted in the medium that preserves things best, the rock itself. Stone remembers what people forget. This is not mysticism, it is geology. The rock of the Lake Superior Basin has been here for more than 1 billion years, surviving ice ages and volcanic events and the slow drift of continents, and it will be here long after every human structure on its surface has been reduced to dust. When people carved passages into that rock 2,000 or 3,000 or 5,000 years ago, they created features that the rock would preserve indefinitely, features that the rock is only now revealing to the people with the tools to look for them. The patience required by this kind of preservation is larger than any human patience. It is the patience of stone, which is to say that it is not patience at all but simply persistence, the mindless continuity of matter through time, indifferent to whether anyone ever comes along to look. But someone has come along to look, and what they are seeing, through the medium of data and algorithms and the translation of reflected waves into colored images on screens, is a record of human activity that the conventional historical account of this continent had no place for. The conventional account said that the territory north of the Rio Grande was home to peoples who were sophisticated in some ways and limited in others, who had developed impressive earthwork traditions and extensive trade networks, but who had not achieved the kind of organized large-scale engineering that leaves durable underground works. The scan data says that this account may need revision, not because the people were doing things that were impossible for peoples at their stage of development to do, but because the conventional account underestimated their stage of development and the range of what they were actually doing. Underestimating indigenous capability in pre-Columbian North America has a long history, and it is not a history that reflects well on the people who have done the underestimating. The tendency to see the peoples of pre-Columbian North America as simple or static or somehow less than the complex, dynamic, engineering-capable societies that the evidence now shows them to have been, is a tendency that was partly produced by the shock of encounter and partly produced by the need to justify dispossession, which is much easier if the people being dispossessed can be portrayed as having done nothing in particular with the land they occupied. The people who documented the Hopewell earthworks in the 19th century sometimes attributed them to a lost white race rather than to the indigenous peoples, who were demonstrably still present on the landscape and who had oral traditions concerning the earthworks. This attribution was not the product of evidence. It was the product of a framework that could not accommodate the idea that indigenous peoples had built works of such scale and sophistication. And the framework was wrong. The framework has been substantially corrected over the past several decades through the work of archaeologists and anthropologists and historians who have taken the evidence seriously and followed it where it leads rather than where the older frameworks wanted it to go. The tunnel network hypothesis is part of this broader corrective project, and it is important to understand it in that context. It is not a fringe idea promoted by people who are trying to attribute indigenous works to lost civilizations or extraterrestrial visitors. It is a mainstream scientific hypothesis, carefully grounded in the available evidence, advanced by researchers who are fully committed to following the evidence and to working collaboratively with the indigenous communities whose heritage is most directly involved. The fact that it is a hypothesis that challenges some of the conventional assumptions about the scope of pre-Columbian North American engineering is not a mark against it. It is a reason to take it seriously and to invest in the investigation that will allow it to be properly tested. What makes this moment in the investigation particularly significant is that the technical capability now exists to test it more directly than before. The scan technologies have improved to the point where they can resolve features at the relevant depths with the precision needed to distinguish human-made from natural underground features. The dating technologies have improved to the point where organic material recovered from underground contexts at depth can be dated with sufficient precision to place the features in meaningful historical context. The collaborative frameworks between researchers and indigenous communities have developed enough in some cases to make genuine partnership possible in the investigation. And the institutional recognition that pre-Columbian North American archaeology is a field where major discoveries are still possible and where the conventional account has significant gaps has grown to the point where funding for unconventional research questions is at least imaginable, even if it remains difficult to obtain. The copper itself, scattered across burial mounds from Ohio to Illinois to the Gulf Coast, represents the output end of the system that the tunnel network hypothesis is trying to understand the input end of. Each piece of that copper was pulled from the ground by someone who knew where to look and how to work the rock. Each piece passed through hands that understood its value and its significance. Each piece traveled routes that the landscape made possible and that the social organization of the peoples involved made practical. The tunnel network, if it is what the scan data suggests it might be, is the starting point of all of that. It is the place where the copper entered the human world, the underground space where the most fundamental act of the exchange system took place, the act of taking from the earth something that the earth had been holding for millions of years and turning it into something that human hands could make and human communities could value and human networks could circulate. The act of taking from the earth requires a relationship with the earth. This is not metaphor. It is a practical observation about the nature of successful long-term extraction, which requires understanding the geological system being exploited well enough to work with it rather than against it, and which requires making decisions about sustainable rates of extraction that keep the resource available over the long timescales that a multi-generational enterprise demands. The peoples who worked the Lake Superior copper for thousands of years clearly achieved this. The resource was still there, still being extracted, still available for industrial mining in the 19th century, which means that the pre-Columbian extraction did not deplete it beyond recovery. Whether this reflects conscious management, practical constraint, or simply the limits of what pre-industrial extraction technology could accomplish is a question worth asking, and the answer is probably some combination of all three. But the result, an intact resource available for subsequent use, is consistent with a tradition of engagement with the underground world that was organized and deliberate enough to be sustainable. There is something worth sitting with in that. The fact that a tradition of underground extraction that the evidence now suggests lasted for thousands of years left the resource intact for the next users. The fact that the works of that tradition are now being found by people using technologies that would have been incomprehensible to the people who built them, but found in a form that preserves the record of what those people knew and did with enough fidelity that the modern investigation can begin to recover it. The fact that the land itself, the rock that was worked and tunneled and shaped, held the evidence through all the time that intervened, through the disruptions and the dispossessions and the industrialization and the physical transformation of the landscape by subsequent occupants. The land held it, the rock held it, and now the scans are letting the modern world see it for the first time, or perhaps not for the first time. Perhaps the oral traditions of the peoples who maintain knowledge of these underground works through all the intervening centuries and the disruptions that century brought represent a continuity of knowledge that was never actually broken, just driven underground in a different sense. The tunnel network is underground. The knowledge of it, held in fragments and memories and traditions by the peoples whose ancestors built it, has also been underground in a cultural sense, not fully accessible to outsiders, not recognized by the institutions whose job is to document and interpret the past, not visible in the frameworks that the conventional historical account used to construct its story of this landscape. The scans are making the tunnels visible. The collaborative research is making the knowledge visible. And together they are beginning to reconstruct a picture of pre-Columbian North American underground engineering that the conventional account did not know to look for. What is the right response to this? What should a person do with the knowledge that the earth beneath some of the oldest mining districts in North America may hold the remnants of an underground engineering tradition that predates European contact by thousands of years, a tradition that was built by the ancestors of peoples who are still here, who still hold fragments of the knowledge that made the tradition possible, and who have been saying, in various ways and through various channels, that the standard account of this continent's history is incomplete? The right response is probably something like this. Pay attention. Take the evidence seriously. Support the research. Listen to the communities whose heritage is most directly at stake. And hold the knowledge you already have with a little more humility, because the story of this land is longer and more complex and more interesting than any account you have encountered has fully captured. The rock is patient. The knowledge is persistent. The investigation is ongoing. And somewhere beneath a hillside in Michigan or Ohio or Pennsylvania or Ontario, in a passage cut into basalt or limestone by hands that understood the rock in ways that most people today could not begin to approximate, the evidence is waiting for the tools and the questions and the collaborative relationships that can finally bring it to light. Not all of it will be legible. Not all of it will survive in interpretable form. Not all of the questions it raises will be answerable with the evidence that can be recovered, but enough probably to change the story in ways that matter. Enough to restore to the record something of the complexity and the sophistication and the deep engagement with the land that the peoples of pre-Columbian North America actually practiced over the thousands of years of their presence in this place. Enough to complicate, in ways that are ultimately enriching rather than destabilizing, the account that we have been telling ourselves about where the history of this continent begins and who was doing things worth remembering. The copper did not mine itself. The passages did not dig themselves. The network did not organize itself. People made all of these things. People who knew what they were doing and why. People who passed their knowledge on and built on what they received and left behind. Works that are still speaking, even now, to anyone who knows how to listen. Why does it take this long? That is a question worth sitting with before we go any further into the details of what the investigation is uncovering. Why does it take a century and a half of archaeological work in the Lake Superior copper country before someone asks, in a serious and sustained way, whether the extensive pre-Columbian mining activity in that region left underground works that the surface investigation had missed? Why does it take the coincidental convergence of subsurface survey data collected for an unrelated engineering purpose and a researcher with the right combination of expertise and curiosity to begin to see the pattern that the data was always there to reveal? Why, in other words, does the investigation of the tunnel networks beneath America's oldest mines begin so late, when the evidence that something was there has been accumulating in survey reports and oral traditions and the distributional patterns of archaeological material for generations? The answer is not simple, and it has several components that are worth understanding separately even though they interact with each other in the real situation. The first component is purely methodological. Until recently, the tools simply did not exist to see what is now becoming visible. Ground-penetrating radar of sufficient resolution to resolve human-scale features at the depths involved has only been available for a few decades. The processing power needed to handle the data volumes produced by multi-technique subsurface surveys and to combine them into composite images with interpretable detail has only been available more recently still. The databases and analytical frameworks needed to compare data from multiple sites across a region and identify shared patterns have been built up incrementally over years of survey work that was, individually, focused on different questions. The tools had to be developed before they could be applied. This is simply the normal trajectory of scientific capability, and the fact that the investigation could not have been done earlier is a consequence of the pace of technological development rather than of any failure of attention or imagination. The second component is disciplinary. The question of pre-Columbian underground engineering in the Lake Superior region sits at the intersection of several academic disciplines that historically have not communicated well with each other. Subsurface engineering and geotechnical assessment, the fields that produce the survey data, operate with completely different frameworks, methods, vocabularies, and publication venues than archaeology and cultural anthropology, the fields that are most interested in what the survey data might mean for understanding pre-Columbian North American societies. The engineers conducting the stability assessments that produced the original anomalous data were not thinking about pre-Columbian archaeology, and the archaeologists working on pre-Columbian copper mining were not reading geotechnical survey reports. The data was sitting in one literature, and the interpretive framework for understanding it was sitting in another, and the two literatures rarely overlap. Interdisciplinary connections of the kind needed to bring these data and these frameworks together are difficult to build and easy to overlook, and when they happen, they tend to happen through individual researchers rather than through systematic institutional processes. The third component is more uncomfortable and more politically significant than the first two. The question of what pre-Columbian North American societies were capable of, and what they actually did with the landscape they inhabited for tens of thousands of years, has been systematically distorted throughout the history of North American archaeology by a set of assumptions and biases that reflected the political and social needs of the colonial and post-colonial societies that produced, funded the research. The tendency to underestimate the engineering capability of pre-Columbian North American peoples, to attribute impressive works to lost races, or to explain them as the product of simpler activities than the evidence actually supports, was not accidental. It served purposes. It made the dispossession of the peoples who had built those works easier to rationalize. It made the claim that the colonizing societies were bringing civilization to a wilderness more defensible. It allowed the colonial project to proceed with a cleaner conscience than the actual facts of the situation warranted. This is not a comfortable thing to say about the history of a scientific discipline, and it is important to be clear that the distortions in question were not always or primarily the result of conscious bad faith on the part of individual researchers. Most of the archaeologists who worked in the Lake Superior region in the 19th and early 20th centuries were committed to honest investigation of the evidence by the standards of their time, and many of them documented things that, if followed properly, would have led sooner to the kinds of questions that the tunnel network hypothesis is now raising. The distortions operated more at the level of the interpretive frameworks that researchers inherited and worked within than at the level of individual dishonesty. Frameworks that told you what kinds of explanations were acceptable and what kinds were not. Frameworks that made certain questions seem natural to ask and certain others seem not worth pursuing. Frameworks that encoded, in their basic assumptions about what pre-Columbian peoples were and were not capable of, the biases of the societies that produced them. Challenging those frameworks, which is what the best pre-Columbian archaeology of the past several decades has been doing with increasing success, requires not just better evidence but a willingness to recognize and question the assumptions that shape how evidence is gathered and interpreted. This is harder than it sounds, because the assumptions are often invisible to the people who hold them. They look like common sense or methodological rigor rather than like ideology. But they are ideology, and identifying them as such, and being willing to do the interpretive work of asking what the evidence actually shows, rather than what the framework says it should show, is one of the things that makes the tunnel network investigation methodologically significant beyond its specific subject matter. The researchers who are most deeply engaged with this investigation are, to their credit, explicit about all of this. They are explicit about the limits of the scan data and what it cannot tell them. They are explicit about the provisional character of the tunnel network hypothesis and the work that remains to be done to test it properly. They are explicit about the colonial dimensions of the history of archaeological interpretation in the region and the need to do this investigation differently from how earlier investigations have been done, with full partnership of the indigenous communities whose knowledge and heritage are at stake, rather than simply as objects of study. This kind of methodological self-awareness is not always present in the scientific literature on pre-Columbian North America, and its presence here is one of the things that distinguishes the tunnel network investigation from the less careful treatments of pre-Columbian archaeological anomalies that sometimes appear in popular literature. The popular literature on pre-Columbian North American mysteries has historically had a problem, and that problem is worth naming directly because the tunnel network investigation has the potential to be pulled into its orbit in ways that would not serve the investigation or the subject. The problem is the tendency to explain anomalous evidence of pre-Columbian complexity by invoking lost civilizations, ancient white races, or extraterrestrial intervention, rather than by taking seriously the sophistication of the actual peoples who were there. This tendency is not simply intellectually sloppy, though it is that. It is also, in many of its manifestations, racist, because it consistently refuses to credit indigenous peoples with achievements that the evidence attributes to their ancestors, and instead invents fictional superior peoples to take credit for those achievements. The mound builder myth, the idea that the great earthworks of eastern North America were built by a vanished race of white people rather than by the indigenous peoples whose ancestors demonstrably built them, is the most egregious and historically significant example of this pattern. But it is not the only one, and its basic structure, anomalous evidence for complexity, inability to credit indigenous capability, invention of alternative builders, recurs in various forms throughout the popular literature on pre-Columbian mysteries. The tunnel network hypothesis is not that. It does not propose mysterious lost builders or exotic origins. It proposes that the indigenous peoples of the Lake Superior region and the broader Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley, peoples whose descendants are still here, whose oral traditions still preserve fragments of relevant knowledge, whose archaeological record already demonstrates sophistication in earthwork construction and long-distance exchange, extended that sophistication underground in ways that the conventional, surface-focused archaeology had not previously recognized. This is not a more dramatic or more romantic story than the lost civilization narrative. It is a more historically accurate and more respectful story, and it is the one that the evidence supports. The evidence, as we have been discussing, comes from multiple directions, and each direction has its own character and its own limitations. The scan data provides geometric information about the underground features but cannot directly confirm their human origin or provide dates for their construction. The oral traditions provide contextual and interpretive information, but are subject to the same kinds of transmission, distortion, and selective preservation that affect all oral knowledge. The archaeological surface record provides chronological and material information about the above-ground aspects of the activities that the tunnel networks may have supported, but does not directly access the underground dimension. The documentary record from the early industrial period documents the existence and extent of pre-existing surface workings that the industrial miners encountered and used as guides, but does not describe what lay below those surface workings. Each line of evidence is incomplete in ways that the others can partially compensate for, and the convergence of all of them, pointing in the same general direction even though none of them is individually decisive, is what makes the hypothesis worth taking seriously. There are specific accounts in the documentary record of the early industrial period that are worth pulling out and examining in more detail, because they have been available to researchers for over a century and have not, until recently, been read in a way that recognized their potential relevance to the tunnel network question. The journals and reports of the mining engineers and surveyors who worked in the Lake Superior copper country in the 1840s and 1850s, when systematic exploration of the mining district was just beginning, contain a number of observations about pre-existing works that are more interesting than they have generally been treated. Some of these observations describe pre-existing surface pits and trenches of considerable extent. This was well known and has been discussed in the archaeological literature for generations. But some of the accounts describe encounters with what the observers called underground passages that predated the industrial workings and that the industrial miners found when they extended their shafts and drifts to depth. The description of these encounters is brief in most cases, noting the finding and moving on to more immediately practical matters, which is entirely understandable given that the observers were primarily concerned with ore production rather than archaeological documentation. But the encounters are noted, and the descriptions of what was encountered, old workings at depth that showed signs of extensive previous activity, are consistent with the tunnel network hypothesis in ways that have not previously been recognized as significant. One account, from the Journal of a Mining Engineer working on the Keweenaw Peninsula in 1848, describes breaking through into a passage at approximately 50 feet depth that appeared to run horizontally in two directions. The passage was filled with water and the engineer did not attempt to explore it, noting simply that it appeared to be an old working and marking the location on his survey sheet as an obstacle to be managed. He did not ask how it got there or how old it was, which would have been remarkable questions for a practical mining engineer in 1848 to ask about an obstacle he needed to drain and work around. But he noted it, and the survey sheet that recorded its location has survived in the mining company archive, and the location it records corresponds, when converted to modern coordinates, to a zone of subsurface anomalies in the recent scan data. This is not proof. A single data point of this kind is not proof of anything, except that something existed at that location in 1848 that the engineer noticed and recorded. But it is another piece of the pattern. Another indication that the underground features the scans are now showing were real physical things that people encountered rather than artifacts of the imaging process, and that their pre-industrial origin was recognized, in a practical if not an investigative sense, by the earliest users of the industrial mining district. The engineering journals and company records of the early industrial period represent an archive that has not been systematically searched for references of this kind, and the researcher who has begun doing that search has found enough preliminary results to suggest that the archive contains considerably more information about encounters with pre-existing underground works than the archaeological literature has previously registered. This is, to be clear, the kind of historical research that is slow and painstaking and unglamorous, and that nevertheless has the potential to significantly change what we know. Going through boxes of 19th century engineering journals looking for passing references to old workings is not the kind of work that gets dramatized in popular accounts of discovery, but it is the kind of work that, accumulated over time and combined with the scan data and the oral traditions and the archaeological surface record, builds the evidentiary case for a significant revision of the standard account. The standard account says that systematic underground mining in the Lake Superior region began with the industrial mining of the mid-19th century. The accumulating evidence says that this is wrong, and that the industrial mining was built on a foundation, sometimes literally, of much earlier underground works whose scale and organization have not previously been properly understood. The misapprehension has consequences that go beyond the historiographical. The legal and political frameworks that govern the treatment of pre-Columbian cultural resources in the United States assign significance and protection to archaeological sites based on a set of assumptions about what kinds of features are likely to be significant and where they are likely to occur. Underground features at depth in active or former mining districts are not the kinds of features that those frameworks were designed to protect, and the institutional infrastructure for identifying and managing them as cultural resources does not yet fully exist. The scan data that is revealing the tunnel network anomalies is, in most cases, being collected in the context of engineering assessments rather than archaeological investigations, which means that the institutional framework within which it is being interpreted is oriented toward engineering decisions rather than toward cultural resource management. Developing the institutional frameworks needed to translate the scan data findings into appropriate protective and investigative action for the underlying cultural resources is an additional challenge that the researchers involved are beginning to work on, but that has not yet been resolved. The implications of this for the preservation of the tunnel network features are significant. Underground features in former mining districts are subject to a range of disturbance and destruction risks that are not present for surface archaeological sites. The ground stability concerns that motivate the subsurface surveys in the first place reflect real physical risks to the integrity of the underground features. Water infiltration and freeze-thaw cycling affect underground features just as they affect surface ones, and in some cases more severely. And the possibility of development pressure, particularly where former mining land is being considered for residential, commercial, or industrial reuse, creates additional risks to features that lack formal protection. Getting the cultural resource management framework in place before the features are damaged or destroyed is genuinely urgent, and the urgency has not yet been matched by action at the institutional level. This may change as the research becomes more visible and the case for the significance of the tunnel network features becomes better documented. The history of pre-Columbian archaeology in North America includes examples of sites that were recognized as significant only after substantial portions of them had already been destroyed. And the lesson of those examples is that early recognition and early protection are much more effective than retroactive efforts to rescue what remains after the most significant portions are gone. The tunnel network investigation represents an opportunity to do better than that record suggests has typically been done, and the researchers involved are at least aware of the opportunity even if they are not yet in a position to fully act on it. What would proper protection and investigation of the tunnel network features look like if the institutional and resource constraints were removed? It would look like a multi-year, multidisciplinary research program combining continued non-invasive subsurface survey with targeted drilling and sampling to retrieve datable material and characterize the fill and construction of the passages. It would include systematic review of the documentary record of the early industrial period across all of the relevant mining districts, looking for the kinds of passing references to pre-existing underground works that the preliminary archival research has begun to find. It would involve intensive collaboration with the indigenous communities most directly connected to the region, both to ensure that the research respects their rights and interests, and to bring the knowledge those communities hold into the analytical process in a way that can genuinely inform interpretation. It would include careful integration with the broader archaeological literature on the Hopewell interaction sphere and the old copper complex, situating the tunnel network evidence in the context of what is already known about the organization and scale of pre-Columbian copper extraction and distribution in the region. And it would, eventually, produce a revised account of what was happening in the Lake Superior region and the broader Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley in the period between roughly 6,000 and 1,000 years ago, an account that gives proper weight to the underground dimension of the engineering and economic activities of the peoples of that time and place, and that restores to the historical record something of the full complexity of what those peoples were doing in a landscape that they had been managing, in both the above-ground and underground senses, for far longer than the conventional account has recognized. This revised account would not diminish the standard story. It would not require abandoning anything that the standard story gets right about the above-ground archaeology of the region, which is genuinely impressive and genuinely well documented. What it would do is add a dimension that the standard story has been missing, a depth dimension, literally and figuratively, a recognition that the peoples of pre-Columbian North America were engaging with the earth not only on its surface, but in its depths, and that the evidence of that deeper engagement has been sitting in the rock all along, preserved by the same geological permanence that makes the rock itself one of the most reliable archives of information about the past that the physical world provides. The copper that moved from Lake Superior to Ohio burial mounds carries in its chemical signature the story of its geological origin. The rock in which the tunnels were cut carries in its physical structure the story of the work that was done to it. The oral traditions of the peoples whose ancestors did that work carry in their persistence through centuries of disruption the story of the knowledge that made the work possible, and the scan data carries in its arrays of colored gradients the story of what remains underground to be found. All of these stories are parts of the same story, a story about people who were here, who knew this land in its full depth, who built infrastructure for the extraction and distribution of its mineral wealth that served their communities and their exchange networks for thousands of years, and who left in the rock a record of their presence and their capability that is only now, in this moment, becoming visible to the eyes that have learned to look for it. The Appalachian Mountains complicate the story in ways that are worth dwelling on, because the complication points towards something larger than the Lake Superior copper country alone. The Central Appalachians, the long ridge and valley country that runs from Pennsylvania down through Virginia and West Virginia and into the Tennessee and North Carolina highlands, are not copper country in the same sense that the Lake Superior Basin is. The mineralogy is different, the geological history is different, but the mountains have their own mineral wealth, and they have their own history of human interaction with the underground. And the scan campaigns that have been conducted in certain parts of the Appalachian mining districts are producing anomalies that, while different in their specific character from the Lake Superior anomalies, share enough family resemblance to suggest that what we are looking at is not a local phenomenon but something more geographically extensive. The Appalachian anomalies are associated in the locations where they have been most systematically documented, with areas of galena concentration. Galena is lead sulfide, the primary ore of lead, and it occurs in the Appalachian region in deposits that have been known and exploited since the earliest European settlement. But the lead itself was not the reason pre-Columbian peoples interacted with galena. The reason was the mineral's optical properties. Galena is a highly reflective mineral, metallic gray in color, with a brightness that makes it visually striking. When ground to a powder, it produces a brilliant reflective pigment that was widely used across pre-Columbian North America for ceremonial body decoration and for marking objects of special significance. The galena that appears in ceremonial and burial contexts across a wide swath of eastern North America has been traced, through isotopic analysis of its specific lead signature, to particular source areas in the Appalachian region and to the Midwest. Specific quarry or mine locations are, in some cases, identifiable from the chemical data even when the extraction sites themselves have not been archaeologically documented on the surface. The scan anomalies in the galena-bearing areas of the Central Appalachians suggest underground access to galena deposits that would not have been accessible from the surface at the concentrations and in the forms that the archaeological distribution implies were being extracted. Surface galena in the Appalachian region tends to occur in limited quantities and in forms that are not ideal for processing into pigment. The high-quality, pure galena that produces the best ceremonial pigment occurs in deeper deposits, associated with specific geological structures in the limestone and dolostone country rock that requires you to go below the surface to reach it in quantity. The tunnel network signatures in the scan data from these areas are consistent with access passages to deeper galena concentrations, which would account for the volumes of high-quality galena that the archaeological distribution implies were being extracted from these source areas. The galena connection is significant for another reason beyond the practical extraction question. Galena, as a reflective and visually striking material, had strong symbolic associations in many pre-Columbian North American cosmological frameworks. Its brilliant metallic surface made it a material associated with light, with vision, with the kind of seeing that shamanic traditions describe as direct perception of the spirit world rather than ordinary visual experience. The underground locations where galena was extracted were, in the framework of those traditions, places where the material crossed the boundary between the below world and the surface world, places where the powers associated with underground space were concentrated and accessible in a form that could be extracted and brought back to the surface community. The act of extracting galena from underground deposits was not simply a quarrying operation. It was an interaction with the underground world that carried cosmological significance for the people who performed it. This may seem like a long way from practical mining engineering, but it is actually directly relevant to how we understand the organization of the extraction enterprise. In traditions where the underground has this kind of cosmological significance, access to underground space is not simply a matter of having the technical capability to get there. It is a matter of having the appropriate relationship with the underground world and the appropriate social standing to engage with it on behalf of the community. The people who go underground in those traditions are not simply workers. They are intermediaries, people whose role gives them access to spaces and materials that are not available to everyone. And the social organization of underground access, the question of who goes underground, under what circumstances, with what kind of preparation and what kind of authority, reflects and reinforces the broader social organization of the communities involved. Understanding the tunnel networks, then, as both engineering works and as ceremonially significant spaces is not a contradiction. It is a recognition that, For the people who built and used them, those two dimensions were not separable. The tunnels were engineered spaces that served practical extraction purposes and simultaneously participated in the cosmological framework that gave the extraction its meaning and organized the social roles around it. This integration of the practical and the symbolic is characteristic of many pre-literate societies and is one of the things that makes those societies difficult to understand through frameworks developed in the context of modern Western culture, which tends to treat practical engineering and symbolic meaning as belonging to separate domains. For the peoples of pre-Columbian North America, as for many others, they were not separate, and any account of the tunnel works that treats them as one without the other is necessarily incomplete. The pipestone quarries of southwestern Minnesota offer another angle on this integration of practical extraction and cosmological significance in the underground dimension of pre-Columbian North American landscape use. Catlinite, the reddish stone that gives pipestone its name and that was used throughout eastern North America for the manufacture of sacred pipe bowls, occurs in a distinctive geological formation in the Minnesota pipestone country that has been quarried, as the evidence shows, for at least 3,000 years. The surface quarrying at the Pipestone National Monument site has been documented and studied, and the oral traditions of the peoples who quarried there, including the Lakota and Dakota nations, preserve detailed knowledge of the site and its significance. But the surface quarries that are visible today represent only the accessible portion of the Pipestone deposit, which continues underground beyond the depth at which open-pit extraction becomes impractical. The scan campaigns conducted in the area around the Pipestone site in the context of monitoring for ground stability have identified subsurface anomalies that are consistent with underground access to the deeper portions of the Catlinite deposit. Whether these anomalies represent the same kind of organized tunnel network that the Lake Superior and Appalachian data is suggesting, or whether they represent less organized underground activity of a different character, is not yet clear from the data. But they add another location to the growing map of subsurface anomalies in areas associated with pre-Columbian mineral extraction, and they strengthen the case for a geographically extensive tradition of underground engagement with mineral resources that predates the industrial mining of those resources by centuries or millennia. The geographic extent of the pattern, from the Lake Superior Basin to the Central Appalachians to the Minnesota Pipestone country, is itself significant. It suggests that whatever tradition of underground mineral extraction is leaving these signatures in the subsurface data was not confined to a single people in a single location, but was distributed across a much larger area of pre-Columbian North America. Whether this reflects a single broadly shared cultural tradition of underground mining, or whether it reflects the independent development of similar practical responses to similar extraction challenges in different locations, or some combination of both, is a question the current evidence cannot definitively answer. But the distribution of the pattern across sites that were connected in the above-ground record through the Hopewell interaction sphere and related exchange networks suggests that the underground component of this system was also connected, that the knowledge and techniques of underground extraction moved through the same networks that moved the products of that extraction. Knowledge traveling through networks is one of the more difficult things to recover archaeologically, because knowledge does not preserve the way stone and copper do. You cannot pick up a piece of knowledge and analyze its isotopic signature to determine where it came from. What you can do is look at the technical characteristics of the things that knowledge produced and compare them across different locations to see whether they reflect the same underlying tradition of practice. The tunnel passages at different sites, as far as the scan data allows comparison, share enough technical characteristics, consistent depth profiling, similar passage dimensions, the same general tendency toward regular spacing and geometric orientation, to suggest that they were built by people working from a shared technical tradition, rather than independently inventing solutions to the same problems. This shared technical tradition is what the movement of knowledge through the Hopewell networks would have produced, and its presence in the underground works is consistent with the broader picture of the Hopewell system as one in which information and technique, not just material goods, were circulating across the network. There are parallel situations in other parts of the world that provide useful comparative context for thinking about what pre-Columbian underground mining networks might have looked like in terms of their organization and their cultural significance. The ancient Phoenician and Carthaginian mining operations in the Iberian Peninsula, which began around the first millennium before the Common Era and continued under Roman control after the 2nd century BCE, represent one of the most extensively documented examples of organized ancient underground mining in the historical record. The Roman mining operations at Rio Tinto and at other sites in southern Spain extracted enormous quantities of copper, silver, and gold using tunnel networks of considerable complexity, and the documentation of those operations in ancient sources and in the archaeological record provides a sense of the organizational infrastructure that efficient, large-scale, ancient underground mining required. The Iberian mining operations are not directly comparable to the pre-Columbian North American situation in most respects. Different people, different time period, different geological context, different social and economic frameworks. But the comparison is useful for one specific purpose, which is demonstrating that organized underground mining at significant scale was achievable by pre-industrial societies using the kinds of tools and organizational capacities that archaeological evidence attributes to those societies. If the Carthaginians and Romans could build and operate extensive underground mining networks in the 1st millennium BCE and the 1st millennium CE using bronze and iron tools, and the kind of organizational capacity that complex, pre-industrial societies develop, there is no a priori reason to think that the peoples of pre-Columbian North America, who had been working copper for longer and who had demonstrated comparable organizational capacity in their earthwork construction, could not have built and operated comparable underground works in their own context. The tools available to pre-Columbian North American underground miners were not bronze or iron. They were stone, primarily copper chisels and stone hammers, and in some cases fire setting, the technique of applying heat and then cold water to rock to induce thermal fracturing that makes it easier to break. Fire setting is documented in ancient mining contexts worldwide and is effective enough that it was used in European mines well into the historical period. The evidence for its use in Lake Superior copper mines, in the form of charcoal and thermally altered rock at known pre-Columbian extraction sites, has been known to archaeologists since the 19th century. The existence of these documented surface extraction techniques, combined with the evidence from the scan data for underground features that required significant rock removal to create, implies that the people who built the tunnel networks had effective rock working techniques at their disposal, even without metal tools in the European sense. The copper chisels are particularly relevant here because they represent a practical advantage in rock working that is directly connected to the product being extracted. The Lake Superior copper mines produced the raw material for copper tools, and the people who were extracting that copper had access to copper tools, which are effective enough at cutting and chiseling rock to be used for tunnel construction at a working rate that would produce the features the scans are revealing over the timescales that the archaeological record implies were available. The people extracting copper in the Lake Superior region were, in other words, in possession of tools that gave them a genuine technical advantage in underground work, an advantage that their contemporaries, who did not have access to native copper in the same quantities, would not have had. This may be another dimension of the special significance of the Lake Superior Copper District, not only the source of a socially significant material, but the location of a capability advantage in underground construction that was not available everywhere. The question of labor organization, of how you get enough people working in a coordinated enough way to construct and maintain an underground network of the scale the scan data is suggesting, is one that deserves direct attention because it is sometimes used as an implicit argument against pre-Columbian engineering capability. The argument goes something like this. Pre-Columbian societies in eastern North America were not sufficiently hierarchically organized or sufficiently populous to mobilize the labor required for large-scale construction. Therefore, large-scale construction did not happen, But this argument has two flaws. The first is that the premise is wrong. We know that the peoples of Eastern North America were capable of mobilizing very large amounts of labor for the construction of earthworks, and the organizational structures that made that possible, while different from the hierarchical command structures that characterize state-level societies, were effective enough to produce results that compare favorably with contemporaneous construction anywhere in the world. The second flaw is that the argument mistakes a conclusion for a premise, reasoning from what it assumes about capability to what it is willing to accept as evidence for capability, rather than reasoning from the evidence about what capability actually existed. The earthworks demonstrate the labor mobilization capability directly. The Newark earthworks required the movement of millions of cubic feet of earth in a configuration that required precise surveying and careful planning over a very long time. Poverty Point in Louisiana, the great earthwork complex of the Gulf Coast that dates to roughly 1000 BCE, required labor inputs that have been calculated to be equivalent to several million person-days of work. The construction of these works was not the product of surplus labor in a hierarchical agrarian society of the kind that built the pyramids of Egypt or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia. It was the product of a different kind of organizational capability, one based on the voluntary mobilization of labor around shared ceremonial purposes and shared participation in exchange networks that provided collective benefits to the communities involved. The people came to build the earthworks for reasons that were compelling to them within their own social and cosmological frameworks, and they came in numbers sufficient to do the work over the timescales that the construction required. The same organizational capability that built the earthworks could have built and maintained underground networks. The scale of the underground works implied by the scan data, while significant, is not larger relative to the organizational capacity of the societies involved than the earthworks are. If anything, underground construction in a mineralized zone where there is a direct material payoff in the form of copper or galena or pipestone may have been easier to organize than earthwork construction whose benefits were primarily ceremonial and social, because the material benefits are more immediately tangible and more directly distributed among the participants. You built the earthwork to participate in a shared ceremonial and exchange system that provided diffuse benefits to the community over time. You built the underground extraction network to get the copper that your community needed and traded. The motivation is different. Not more or less compelling in any absolute sense, but different in its directness. There is something worth saying about the people themselves, the individual human beings who went underground in these passages and did the work of extraction and construction and maintenance that the tunnel network required. We do not know their names. We do not have their stories in any direct way. What we have is the physical traces of their work, preserved in the rock that they cut, and the downstream products of that work, preserved in the copper objects and the galena pigment and the pipestone bowls that appear in the archaeological record across a wide swath of eastern North America. From these physical traces and these downstream products, we can infer some things about the character of the work and the nature of the people who did it. They worked in darkness, or near darkness, lit by small lamps burning animal fat or by torches of resinous wood. The light they had would have been sufficient to see what they were immediately working on, but would not have illuminated the passage ahead or behind. In the larger working areas, where the passage widened into extraction chambers, several workers could have been active at once. In the narrower transit corridors, work would have been largely individual, one person at a time, moving through with whatever they were carrying. The air quality in deep underground passages without mechanical ventilation is a genuine concern, and the organization of the passage network to allow natural ventilation, which is one of the things that a grid pattern of interconnected passages can facilitate, may reflect as much an engineering response to the air quality challenge as any other organizational logic. The work itself, the actual extraction of copper or galena, or the rock cutting needed to create or extend a passage, was physically demanding in the way that all sustained manual labor is physically demanding. The people who did it were specialists in the sense that they had specific skills and knowledge that not everyone possessed. but they were not specialists in the sense of a protected and privileged artisan class. The evidence from the broader social context of the woodland period suggests a social organization that was egalitarian enough that high-status roles were more a matter of ceremonial function than of material privilege, and that the people who went underground to extract the copper that gave the Hopewell exchange system its most valued commodity were probably people whose social role was significant rather than lowly, people whose specialized knowledge gave them a distinctive place in their communities rather than a marginal one. This matters for how we think about the tunnel networks, not just as engineering works, but as human places. They were spaces where particular kinds of people did particular kinds of work for reasons that were embedded in the full complexity of the societies they belonged to. They were not simply mines in the industrial sense. They were not simple extraction facilities where labor was applied to a resource to produce an output. They were places where the underground world was engaged, where the cosmological significance of that engagement was acted out through the practical activity of extraction, where the knowledge that made the engagement possible was exercised and transmitted to the next generation of practitioners, and where the social roles that organized access to the underground space and its products were enacted and reinforced. They were, in other words, places in the full human sense, locations embedded in the social and cultural life of the communities that created and used them, and understanding them requires attending to that full human context, rather than treating them as simply technical infrastructure. The scan data, for all its remarkable capability to reveal what lies in the rock at depth, cannot give us that full human context. It gives us geometry. It gives us spatial relationships between underground features. It gives us density contrasts that allow us to distinguish passages from surrounding rock. It cannot give us the experience of moving through those passages in the light of a stone lamp, of feeling the temperature drop as you move deeper into the earth, of hearing the sound of rock cutting ahead of you and knowing that your colleague was working the face in the next section of the network. It cannot give us the names of the people who worked there, or the songs they sang, or the stories they told about the underground world they knew better than anyone on the surface around them. What it can give us, if we are patient and careful and genuinely committed to following the evidence, rather than the story we already expected to find, is a framework for a revised understanding of what pre-Columbian North American peoples were doing in this landscape, and how sophisticated the infrastructure of their engagement with it actually was. That revised understanding matters not only as historical knowledge, but as an act of recognition, a recognition of what the ancestors of people who are still here were capable of, and what they actually did. A restoration of a chapter of the American story that has been missing for too long from the accounts that most people know. The missing chapter is not ancient history in the sense of being safely remote from the present. The descendants of the people who built the tunnel networks are present in the Great Lakes region and the Ohio River Valley and the Central Appalachians today. They have been here continuously through the colonial period and the displacement and the suppression of traditional practices and the 20th century and everything else that has happened. And they are here now, maintaining traditions that carry fragments of the knowledge their ancestors accumulated over thousands of years of engagement with this landscape. The tunnel network investigation is not about recovering something that was entirely lost. It is about filling in a dimension of a story that has always been partially present, partially visible in the oral traditions and the archaeological material and the distributional patterns of the things the underground works produced. The scans are making the underground dimension visible in a new way, but the dimension was always there. The people who knew it were always there. And the story they carry, in the traditions and the memories and the living knowledge of communities that survived everything the colonial period could bring, is the most direct connection we have to the human reality that the tunnels represent. This is why the investigation is most meaningful when it is done in genuine partnership with those communities, not simply as a matter of ethical compliance with legal requirements for consultation, but as a matter of recognizing that the communities and the researchers need each other to understand what the scans are showing. The researchers bring tools and analytical frameworks and access to the comparative archaeological and geological literature. The communities bring knowledge of the landscape and its underground dimensions that has been maintained through channels the researchers cannot access. Neither alone can tell the full story. Together, carefully and with appropriate respect for what each brings, they can begin to reconstruct something of the picture of pre-Columbian underground engineering in eastern North America that the scans are making it possible, for the first time, to seriously investigate. The mines are still there, mostly. Some are flooded, some have caved, some have been built over. But the rock itself persists, and in the rock, the passages that were cut into it thousands of years ago persist as well, altered by time and water and the collapse of some sections and the survival of others, but present, detectable, characterizable by the tools that are now available to look for them. The old mines are not simply industrial history. They are, the scan data is suggesting, the latest chapter in an underground history that goes back much further than anyone who built the industrial shafts knew or suspected. And that underground history is now beginning, slowly, carefully, piece by piece, to come to light. There are researchers who lie awake at night thinking about what might be preserved in those passages, whether there is organic material at depth that has survived because of the stable underground temperature and the absence of the biological activity that accelerates decomposition at the surface, whether there are wooden tools, or plant fiber cordage, or leather objects, or any of the other materials that disappear rapidly under normal archaeological site conditions, but that might persist for thousands of years in the protected environment of a deep tunnel sealed by collapse. Whether there are surfaces that retain evidence of the kind of marking and pigment application that appears at the entrances and in the accessible sections of the mines that have been investigated on the surface. Whether there are things in those passages that would change not just the specific story of pre-Columbian mining in North America, but the broader picture of pre-Columbian material culture and cognitive life in ways that no one has yet had the imagination to anticipate. This is the nature of genuinely open investigation. It does not know in advance what it will find. It proceeds from what the evidence suggests is worth looking for, and it finds things that the evidence did not predict, and those things change the picture in ways that require the whole process to begin again, with revised questions and revised expectations. The tunnel network investigation is at an early stage of this process. The pattern of anomalies has been identified. The preliminary hypothesis has been formulated. The initial testing has been begun. And already, in the preliminary results, there are things that the hypothesis in its original form did not predict. Things that suggest the story is more complex and more interesting than the hypothesis captured. Things that will require the next round of investigation to be more sophisticated than this one. What those things are, specifically, is not yet public in most cases. Researchers who are in the middle of an investigation are understandably cautious about discussing preliminary findings that have not yet been peer-reviewed, and that may or may not hold up under the scrutiny that proper publication requires. But the conversations that are happening in academic contexts, at conferences and in workshops, and in the informal exchanges that constitute the actual life of a field in motion, suggest that the early investigation of the tunnel network anomalies is producing results that are being taken seriously by people whose expertise makes them credible judges of what the evidence means. And the direction of the results, the consensus that is beginning to emerge about what the scans are showing and what it implies, is a direction that points toward a revision of the standard account more significant than any single finding. The revision is not dramatic in the sense that popular accounts of archaeological discovery tend to expect dramatic. There are no treasure chambers. There are no inscriptions in mysterious scripts. There are no artifacts whose existence defies everything we thought we knew about pre-Columbian North America. What there is, what the evidence is beginning to show with increasing clarity, is a picture of organized, sustained, sophisticated underground engineering by the peoples of pre-Columbian Eastern North America that the standard account did not include, and that, when properly understood and incorporated into the broader picture, changes what we know about the scale and complexity of the societies that built and maintained the Hopewell Exchange Network and its predecessors and successors. That is not a small revision. It is a revision that touches the foundations of how we understand this chapter of American history, and it has implications not only for archaeology and anthropology, but for the broader cultural conversation about the pre-Columbian past and the peoples whose ancestors created it. The scans found a tunnel network beneath America's oldest mines. What they found beneath that, when you follow the implications of the tunnel network through everything else that the evidence suggests, is a story about human capability and human connection to the land, and human persistence across the disruptions of history that is longer and more complex and more deeply rooted in this continent than the standard accounts of previously allowed. The rock holds it. The oral traditions hold it. The scan data is beginning to make it visible, and the investigation that is now underway, carefully and collaboratively, and with appropriate attention to all the evidence and all the communities that the evidence implicates, is the beginning of the process by which a chapter of the American story that has been missing for too long will begin to be written back into the record where it belongs. We began with the scans finding something they were not looking for, something too regular, too deliberate, too geometrically precise to be explained by the geology of the region alone. And that is where the best investigations begin. Not with a theory looking for confirmation, but with evidence looking for an explanation. The evidence is still looking. The explanation is still being built. But the shape of it is becoming clearer, and what it is beginning to show is a North America that is older and deeper and richer in human history than the version most people carry in their heads. A North America where the people who have been here longest were also doing things that reach deepest. Into the rock, into the underground, into the full three-dimensional space of the landscape they inhabited, and shaped and understood in ways that are only now beginning to be recovered. The tunnels were not lost, they were waiting, and the waiting, as the scans are now demonstrating, was not in vain. We have been walking through this story for a long time now, and the night is getting late. The earth is still beneath you, and beneath the earth, somewhere, the passages persist in the rock. Not everything that was built has been found. Not everything that was known has been remembered. Not everything that was done has left a trace that modern tools can resolve. But enough has survived to begin to see the shape of what was there. And the shape of what was there is the shape of a civilization, or many civilizations, that were doing things in this landscape for thousands of years before anyone thought to look underground for the evidence of what they had accomplished. Rest with that for a moment. The whole weight of it, pressing up gently through the dark from the rock below, the copper that built the networks of exchange across half a continent, the galena that glittered on the bodies of the people who went underground to get it, the pipestone pipes whose smoke carried prayers that have not been forgotten, not entirely, by the people who still know what the smoke means. The passages in the rock, the geometry of human planning and human work preserved in the most durable medium the earth provides. The scans translating all of that into data, and the data into images, and the images into the beginning of an understanding that the evidence was always there to support, but that the tools and the questions and the collaborative relationships took this long to bring together. If you are still here, if you have followed this story through all its turns and pauses and digressions into the details that any honest account of a complicated investigation requires, then you understand something now that you did not understand at the beginning. Not because the mystery is solved, it is not. Not because all the questions have answers, they do not. But because you have spent time with the evidence, with the slow, patient work of investigators who are taking seriously something that has been overlooked for too long, and that time has given you a different relationship to the landscape you live in, a sense of its depth, its human depth, that goes further down than the surface of the ground on which your world sits. The scans found a tunnel network. What the tunnel network found, when the investigation reached deep enough to ask, is us. Not us in the shallow sense of contemporary identity, but us in the deeper sense of continuity. The same impulse that sent people underground 3,000 years ago to retrieve the copper that would travel south to Ohio burial mounds is the impulse that drives the researchers who are now sending signals into the earth to retrieve the image of what those people left behind. The same knowledge-making that sustained communities for thousands of years in their engagement with the underground world is the knowledge-making that is now, slowly and carefully, and with appropriate humility, beginning to recover what those communities accomplished. The rock is the same, the earth is the same. What changes? over the thousands of years between the building of the passages and the scanning of them, is the language in which the conversation with the underground is conducted. The conversation itself never stopped. It was only, for a while, conducted in a language that the people now doing the listening had not yet learned to hear. We are learning, slowly, imperfectly, with all the institutional and methodological and political challenges that genuine learning in a complicated situation involves. But we are learning. And the story that is emerging from the learning is one that deserves the time and the attention and the care that you have given it tonight, lying in the dark somewhere in North America, on ground that is older and more storied than any map you have ever seen has managed to fully represent. If this has been the kind of company you like to keep in the hours before sleep, then let the algorithm know. Gently, if you like, with a tap of the like. Subscribe if you want more of these long, slow walks through the parts of the American story that the textbooks do not always reach. Leave a comment with where you are tonight, what time it is, what the darkness outside your window feels like. Someone in Ohio near the earthworks, someone in Michigan in the copper country, someone in Minnesota where the pipestone comes from, someone in Virginia in the old Appalachian mining land. We are all on the surface of the same geology, and beneath it, the passages persist, and the story they hold is still being told. Rest well. The ground will still be there in the morning, with everything it holds, waiting to be understood. There is a category of evidence that we have not yet fully addressed, and it is one that the researchers working on the tunnel network hypothesis are increasingly finding they cannot ignore, even though it complicates the picture in ways that are not yet fully resolved. It is the evidence from the eastern seaboard, from the coastal plain and the Piedmont and the lower mountain country of what are now the mid-Atlantic and southeastern states, that suggests the underground engineering tradition we have been discussing did not stop at the Appalachian ridges but extended, in forms that are less well documented and more difficult to interpret, into terrain that the standard archaeological accounts treat as quite different from the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley country. The mica connection is where this eastern extension of the story becomes most compelling. Mica, the sheet silicate mineral that cleaves into thin, transparent flakes with a distinctive luster, appears in Hopewell burial contexts in the Ohio River Valley, in quantities that imply systematic extraction from source areas that are well identified in the geological literature. The primary Hopewell period mica sources are in the Blue Ridge and surrounding mountains of western North Carolina, an area where mica-bearing pegmatite deposits occur in a geological context that makes them locally abundant, but that requires you to know where to look, and in some cases to go underground to look for the highest quality material. The mica that appears in Ohio Hopewell burials as cut sheets and geometric forms and sometimes as elaborate silhouette figures is of a quality that implies selection from the best available deposits, rather than casual collection of surface material, and that quality selection implies systematic extraction from known deposits that were deliberately accessed and worked. The scan campaigns conducted in the mica-bearing terrain of the western North Carolina Piedmont are among the most recent and least fully processed of the surveys that are contributing to the tunnel network picture. The preliminary data from those campaigns shows subsurface anomalies that are consistent with underground access to the deeper mica-bearing pegmatite bodies that would not be accessible from the surface without deliberate excavation. The anomalies are less extensive and less clearly organized than those in the Lake Superior copper country, which may reflect the different character of mica extraction compared to copper extraction, or it may reflect the limitations of the scan resolution in the different geological environment of the Piedmont compared to the basalt country of the Lake Superior Basin, or it may simply mean that the underground works in this area were less developed than those in the primary copper country. More survey work and more careful processing of the existing data will be needed before the picture becomes clearer. But the mica connection matters beyond the extraction question, because mica is another of the materials that the Hopewell tradition treated with a degree of care and intentionality that suggests it had significance beyond its practical utility. Cut mica sheets appear in Hopewell burials in forms that have no obvious practical function. Elaborate geometric cutouts, elaborate silhouette figures of hands and birds and serpents, objects that were made with considerable skill and that were clearly not being used as tools. The significance of mica in the Hopewell ceremonial framework, whatever that significance was enough to justify the extraction of high-quality material from sources several hundred miles from the Ohio River Valley centers, its transport over those distances through the Hopewell Exchange Network, and its careful fabrication into objects that were then buried with individuals of apparent high status. If the underground extraction of mica from the North Carolina pegmatite country was part of the same underground engineering tradition that produced the tunnel networks of the Lake Superior Copper District, then the geographic extent of that tradition is considerably larger than the Lake Superior Basin alone, and the materials it was serving are more diverse than copper alone. A tradition of underground mineral extraction that spans from Lake Superior to western North Carolina, with intermediate nodes in the Galena country of the Appalachians and the Pipestone country of Minnesota, is a tradition that covers an enormous geographic range and that served the raw material needs of one of the most extensive ceremonial exchange networks in the pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere. This is not a small-scale local phenomenon. It is something that operated at the scale of the continent and that represented a significant and sustained commitment of human knowledge, skill, and labor to the organization of access to underground resources. The continental scale of the Hopewell interaction sphere is one of the things that makes it so astonishing to the people who study it, and the tunnel network hypothesis, in its extended geographic form, suggests that the underground infrastructure supporting that continental network may have been itself continental in scale. This is a big claim. It is bigger than the evidence currently available can fully support. But it is the direction that the accumulating data is pointing, and it would be intellectually dishonest to pretend otherwise simply because the full confirmation of the claim will require more work than has yet been done. The people who moved the copper from Lake Superior to the Ohio Valley, the people who moved the mica from western North Carolina to the Ohio Valley, the people who moved the obsidian from Yellowstone and the shark teeth from the Gulf Coast and the galena from the Appalachians, all of these people were operating within a system of relationships and obligations and exchanges that the Hopewell interaction sphere represents. That system did not maintain itself automatically. It required maintenance, human relationships, and trust, and reciprocal obligation, the kind of social infrastructure that makes long-distance exchange possible in the absence of formal markets or state enforcement mechanisms. The maintenance of that social infrastructure was an achievement of the people involved, one that the standard accounts have sometimes undervalued, because the social infrastructure is harder to see in the archaeological record than the material goods it circulated. The tunnel networks, if the hypothesis is correct, represent the physical infrastructure of that same system, the underground counterpart to the earthwork centers and the river routes and the overland trails that constituted its above-ground infrastructure. Understanding the Hopewell system in its full three-dimensional complexity requires understanding not only its surface expression, but its underground expression as well. And the scan data is beginning to make that underground expression visible for the first time. The picture that is emerging is larger and more integrated and more impressive than the picture that surface archaeology alone produced, and it is a picture that does greater justice to the actual achievement of the peoples who built and maintained it. Let us take a moment to think about what it means to maintain an underground mining tradition across generations. Not just building the passages once and using them until they were worked out, but maintaining them, keeping them open, managing the water in them, extending them as the high-grade deposits in their immediate vicinity were exhausted, training new practitioners to know them and work in them. This is the work of institutions, using that word in its broadest sense to mean persistent social structures that outlast individual lifetimes and carry practices and knowledge forward in time. The underground mining tradition of the pre-Columbian Lake Superior region was an institution in this sense, something that was sustained across a period measured not in years or decades, but in centuries and perhaps millennia, by communities that found it worth the investment of resources and training and social organization to keep it going. What makes an institution persist? At the most practical level, the benefits it provides have to exceed the costs it imposes. The underground mining tradition persisted, presumably because the copper and the other materials it produced were worth the investment required to maintain the tradition of extracting them. But practical benefit alone rarely sustains institutions over very long periods. The institutions that persist longest tend to be ones that are embedded in the broader social and ceremonial life of the communities that maintain them, ones whose continuation is understood as meaningful beyond its immediate practical purpose, ones that are connected to stories and identities and obligations that make their maintenance a matter of more than simple economic calculation. The Hopewell ceremonial system, and the underground mining tradition that served it, appear to have been exactly this kind of institution, embedded in cosmological frameworks and social structures that gave their continuation a significance that made the investment in maintaining them feel necessary rather than simply profitable. The decline of the Hopewell system around 1600 years ago is one of the great unresolved questions in North American archaeology. The earthwork centers were abandoned, the long-distance exchange network contracted, the elaborate burial complex disappeared. The specific pattern of material exchange and ceremonial expression that defines the Hopewell tradition in the archaeological record simply ceased, and the communities that had been part of it reorganized into different patterns that are archaeologically distinct from what came before. Why this happened is debated. Climate change, social disruption, the depletion of the ceremonial economy that made the extensive exchange network viable, the emergence of alternative social and political frameworks that organize community life differently, all of these have been proposed as contributing factors. No single explanation has been generally accepted. What the tunnel network hypothesis adds to this conversation is a potential perspective on the resource dimension of the Hopewell decline. If the underground mining infrastructure was as extensive and as important to the functioning of the Hopewell system as the hypothesis suggests, then what happened to that infrastructure at the time of the Hopewell decline is a question with potential significance for understanding the decline itself. Did the underground works become less productive over time as the highest quality deposits were exhausted, contributing to the resource stress that may have weakened the exchange network? Were the underground works abandoned along with the surface earthwork centers, or did they continue to be used by local communities even after the broader network of which they had been part had ceased to function in its original form? Are the people who continued to live in the Lake Superior and Ohio River Valley regions after the Hopewell decline the same people whose oral traditions still preserve knowledge of the underground works? Or did the knowledge pass through multiple hands and communities over the subsequent 1500 years? None of these questions can currently be answered with the evidence available. But they are questions that the tunnel network hypothesis makes it possible to ask, and asking them opens up new ways of thinking about the Hopewell decline that the surface-focused archaeology alone did not make available. The underground dimension of the story may turn out to be relevant not only to understanding how the Hopewell system worked at its peak, but to understanding why it ended when it did. That is a significant potential contribution, and it is another reason why the investigation of the tunnel networks deserves the serious attention and resources that serious archaeological investigation requires. After the Hopewell decline, the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley went through a period of cultural reorganization that eventually produced the late woodland period societies that inhabited the region when the first European contact occurred, and after that, the historically documented nations of the Iroquoian and Algonquian and Siouan language families whose territories in the region the colonial period documentation describes. The relationship between these historical peoples and their woodland period predecessors is a subject of considerable complexity and ongoing scholarly debate, involving questions about cultural continuity and population movement, and the relationship between archaeological cultures and the linguistically and historically defined peoples that the documentary record identifies. The tunnel network hypothesis does not resolve these questions, but it does potentially provide a new kind of evidence for thinking about them, because the oral traditions that carry knowledge of the underground works are held by particular contemporary communities, and the communities that hold the most relevant knowledge may be among the most direct descendants of the communities that built and used the works. The methodologically appropriate stance toward these questions is one of open investigation combined with genuine deference to the communities whose heritage is most directly involved. And this is the stance that the researchers working most seriously on the tunnel network hypothesis are attempting to maintain. It is not always an easy stance to maintain, partly because the research generates knowledge that has implications for questions that the communities involved have their own strongly held positions on, and partly because the academic frameworks within which the researchers work have their own tendencies and pressures that do not always align well with the kinds of collaborative, community-centered research that the situation requires. But the attempt to maintain that stance is itself significant, and the research that is being done in the spirit of that stance is more likely to produce knowledge that is both accurate and ethically defensible than research that proceeds without it. One of the things that long conversations with the evidence teach you, and this conversation has been long enough to have taught you something, is that the past does not stay put. It keeps moving, not in itself, but in our understanding of it. As new evidence comes in and new questions are asked, and new analytical tools are developed, and new collaborative relationships make new kinds of investigation possible. The past is not fixed. Our access to it is not fixed. What we know about it is not fixed, and the story of pre-Columbian North America, specifically, has been changing more rapidly in the past several decades than at any previous period in the history of its investigation, as the combination of new technical capabilities and new interpretive frameworks and a more genuine engagement with indigenous knowledge has produced a succession of revisions that have progressively enriched and complicated the picture. The tunnel network beneath America's oldest mines is the latest chapter in that succession of revisions. It is not the last chapter. It is not the most dramatic chapter, though it is a genuinely significant one. It is simply the chapter that is being written now, the chapter that the scan technology and the preliminary investigation and the growing conversation between researchers and communities are in the process of producing. And like all chapters in a story that is still ongoing, it raises more questions than it answers, and the questions it raises are more interesting than the questions that preceded them, because they are questions that a more complete picture of the past makes it possible to ask. We do not know yet what is in the tunnels. If the tunnels are what the scans suggest they are, we do not know what they will tell us when we can get to them and examine them directly. We do not know whether the datable material will place them in the period that the hypothesis expects, or whether it will reveal a more complicated chronological picture in which different phases of underground activity at different times produce the multi-level architecture that the scan data seems to show. We do not know whether the underground features are confined to the locations that have been scanned or whether the network extends into areas that have not yet been examined, and if the latter, how much further it extends and what kinds of sites it connects. What we do know, with a confidence that the preliminary evidence supports, is that something is there, something human, something organized, something that the conventional accounts of pre-Columbian North American archaeology did not know to look for and therefore did not find. But that was waiting in the rock to be found by anyone who came along with the right tools and the right questions. The right tools now exist. The right questions are now being asked. And the investigation that these tools and questions are making possible is one of the more genuinely exciting research programs in North American archaeology at this moment, not because of the dramatic claims it might be positioned to make, but because of the careful, methodologically serious, community-engaged work it is doing to understand something real about the past of a continent that has more history than any of its inhabitants have yet fully reckoned with. The mines are old, the rock is older, the knowledge of what the rock holds is older still, encoded in traditions that maintain themselves through everything the colonial period did to the communities that carried them. And now the scans are encoding that same knowledge in a new medium, translating the geometry of pre-Columbian underground engineering into data that modern analysis can process and modern investigation can follow. The translation is imperfect. The analysis is incomplete. The investigation has barely begun. But the direction it is pointing is clear enough to change how you think about the ground beneath your feet and that is not nothing. The copper came up out of that ground 3,000 years ago, cold and bright and dense with accumulated social meaning, and travelled south through the hands of people whose names are lost, but whose works persist in the rock, and in the mounds, and in the traditions of their descendants. The galena came up out of the mountain country, ground to reflective powder and carried to ceremonial sites, where it glittered on the skin of people participating in rites. We can only partly reconstruct from the material traces they left. The mica came down from the Blue Ridge, thin and translucent, and cut into shapes that no one now alive knows the full meaning of, but that someone, somewhere, chose to bury with the dead, as if the dead would need it where they were going. All of it coming up out of the ground through passages that the industrial miners found and in some cases destroyed before anyone thought to ask what they were. All of it waiting in the scan data, in the colored gradients and the depth profiles and the spatial relationships between underground features that are the modern language in which the rock speaks to the people who know how to listen. We are listening. The investigation is going on. The rock still holds what it held, and the passages are still down there, and the story of what they represent is still being worked out, carefully and slowly and with proper attention to all the evidence and all the communities that the evidence implicates. Somewhere beneath an old mine in Michigan or Ohio or North Carolina, in the dark and the cold and the weight of the rock above, the work of people who have been dead for 2,000 years persists in the geometry they cut into the stone, not a monument. Not a deliberate message to the future, just the traces of work done by people who knew what they were doing and did it well and left it there when they were finished, not knowing that 2,000 years later, something called ground-penetrating radar would find it and not know what to make of it, and that eventually someone would figure out what it meant, or begin to. The beginning is where we are. Beginning, again, to understand what was always here, what has always been here. What the land holds and the rock holds and the traditions hold and the living knowledge of communities whose ancestors made all of this holds. Beginning to understand, from the surface, what the underground has been saying all along, in the language of geometry and depth, and the patient persistence of matter through time. And in that beginning, there is enough to carry you through the night, enough to fill the dark with something other than the noise of the present moment, enough to give the mind something worth resting on, as the body settles and the breath slows and the day releases its grip, and you drift toward the same place the ancient miners went when their work was done for the day. Not underground, not literally, but into that other dark where the mind goes when it lets go of the waking world, into the space where everything that has been learned and felt and wondered about in the hours of consciousness settles into something that can be carried forward into the morning, when the surface world returns and the questions are still there, and the investigation continues and the rock waits. The rock always waits. That is what rock is for. There is a moment in every serious investigation of the deep past where you realize that the farther back you look, the more the story opens rather than closes. The tunnel network investigation is experiencing this in real time. Every answer the preliminary data provides generates 3 new questions, and those 3 new questions each reveal aspects of the pre-Columbian underground engineering story that had not previously been part of the framework at all. This is how it works when you are genuinely close to something real. The story gets bigger as you get closer, not smaller. The complexity increases rather than resolves, and the patience required to stay with that complexity rather than reaching prematurely for a simple summary, is part of what makes genuinely useful research different from the kind that confirms what the researcher already expected to find. One of the complications that has emerged from the investigation as it has expanded is the question of what came before Hopewell. The Hopewell tradition, which we have been discussing as the primary above-ground context for understanding the tunnel networks, was not the first complex society in the Ohio River Valley and the Great Lakes region. Before Hopewell, there was Adena, an earlier tradition that occupied some of the same territory from roughly 3,000 to 2,000 years ago, and that shares some characteristics with Hopewell while differing in others. And before Edina, there were earlier populations, earlier traditions of earthwork construction and long-distance exchange and ceremonial burial, reaching back into the Archaic period and ultimately to the very earliest human occupation of the eastern North American landscape at the end of the Pleistocene. The tunnel networks, in the most expansive version of the hypothesis, may predate Hopewell entirely. The old copper complex, which we discussed early in this investigation, was active from roughly 7,000 to 3,000 years ago, a span of 4,000 years that encompasses enormous changes in the social and cultural organization of the peoples of the Great Lakes region. The extraction of Lake Superior copper during the old copper complex period was certainly happening at significant scale, as the distribution of old copper objects across the archaeological record of eastern North America demonstrates. The question is whether the underground infrastructure implied by the scan data was already developing during this earlier period, or whether it was a product specifically of the more intensive and better organized exchange system associated with the Hopewell tradition. The answer to this question would require datable evidence from the underground features themselves, and that evidence is not yet available. But the possibility that the tunnel network tradition extends back into the old copper period, into the earliest phase of systematic Lake Superior copper extraction, is one that the hypothesis needs to be open to. A 4,000-year tradition of copper extraction on the scale implied by the archaeological distribution would have had plenty of time to develop sophisticated underground engineering, even without the specific organizational stimulus of the Hopewell ceremonial system. The Hopewell period may have intensified and extended the underground works rather than initiating them, and the question of what the underground infrastructure of the old copper complex looked like is one that the scan data is not yet sophisticated enough to fully address. The deep time of the old copper complex is difficult to hold in mind. 4,000 years is not a short time. It is longer than the entire span of recorded history in the Middle East and Mediterranean, longer than from the building of the Great Pyramid to the present day, longer than any continuous institutional tradition in the modern world. People who worked the Lake Superior copper 7,000 years ago were as remote in time from the Hopewell builders as the Hopewell builders are from us. And yet the archaeological evidence shows continuity in the region over that entire span, a persistence of engagement with the Lake Superior copper resource that outlasted every shorter-term cultural shift, and that suggests the underground mining tradition, if it was as deep-rooted as the hypothesis implies, was one of the more durable features of the regional cultural landscape. Durability in cultural practice is not simply a matter of people continuing to do what they were doing before. It requires active maintenance, ongoing investment, the transmission of knowledge to new practitioners, the adaptation of practice to changing circumstances. The people working the Lake Superior copper fields 5,000 years ago were not simply imitating what their predecessors had done. They were doing what they had learned to do, in ways that they had adapted to the circumstances of their own time and experience, and passing on what they knew to the people who would continue the tradition after them. The knowledge was alive in the way that all knowledge is alive, changing and adapting and being applied to new problems, even while it maintained enough continuity with its origins to be recognizably part of the same tradition. This is what the oral traditions of the contemporary descendants of the old copper complex peoples are preserving, even if the specific content of the knowledge has been altered and condensed and partially lost through the disruptions of the intervening centuries. The traditions are not fossils. They are living knowledge that has continued to adapt and respond to changing circumstances, while maintaining enough of its original character to still carry, in fragments, information about the pre-contact underground world that the ancestors of those traditions inhabited and worked in. The fragments are incomplete. The knowledge is partial, but it is not absent, and the researchers who are taking it seriously as evidence, rather than dismissing it as merely symbolic or mythological, are doing more useful interpretive work than the researchers who have historically treated it as irrelevant to the scientific question. There is a site in the Ohio River Valley, which we will not name specifically because the research there is at a sensitive stage, and the researchers involved are not yet ready to have the location widely publicized, where the scan data and the oral tradition and the surface archaeological record have converged in a way that the principal investigators describe as the most compelling single body of evidence for the tunnel network hypothesis yet assembled. The site has known Hopewell period earthwork features on the surface. It has oral tradition associated with it that describes underground passages in terms that are remarkably specific in their spatial references. And it has a subsurface anomaly signature that, in the composite multi-technique imaging, shows what appears to be a complex of interconnected passages at two depth horizons, oriented in a way that is consistent with both the astronomical alignment patterns observed at other sites and the spatial references in the oral tradition. The researchers who have been working at this site have not published their results yet, for all the reasons of scientific caution that we have already discussed. But they have described the convergence of these three lines of evidence in terms that make clear that they regard it as qualitatively different from the preliminary data from other sites, a case where the multiple independent lines are pointing with enough consistency to the same conclusion that the conclusion has begun to feel more like a finding than a hypothesis. Whether that finding will survive the scrutiny of publication and peer review, and whether the direct investigation of the underground features that the site would eventually require will confirm or complicate the picture, remains to be determined. But the site represents, in the current state of the investigation, the point at which the tunnel network hypothesis is closest to becoming something that can be definitively demonstrated rather than simply argued for. This is where the investigation stands, not at the end, not even at the middle, but at the point where the preliminary work has been done well enough to justify the much harder work of actual excavation and detailed documentation and peer-reviewed publication that will either confirm or revise or overturn the hypothesis. The hard work is ahead. The preliminary work has been enough to establish that the hard work is worth doing, and the people doing it are, by all accounts, doing it with the seriousness and the methodological integrity and the collaborative spirit that the subject requires and that its indigenous stakeholders deserve. Outside the specific investigation of the tunnel networks, the broader intellectual climate for understanding pre-Columbian North American complexity has been shifting in ways that make the tunnel network hypothesis easier to propose and to take seriously than it would have been even a generation ago. The work of scholars like Timothy Porcatat on Cahokia, which has demonstrated that the great Mississippian urban center at the confluence of the Missouri and Illinois rivers with the Mississippi was a genuinely urban phenomenon at its peak, with a population, a degree of political organization, and a level of planned spatial organization that had no parallel in North America north of Mexico, has established beyond reasonable doubt that the peoples of pre-Columbian North America were capable of achieving things that earlier scholars had assumed were beyond their reach. Cahokia itself has subsurface dimensions that are only beginning to be systematically investigated. The great mound at the center of the Cahokia complex, Monk's Mound, is the largest earthwork in North America north of Mexico, and its construction involved the movement of an amount of earth that staggers the imagination when you sit with it for a moment. But Cahokia is not primarily a mining site, and the kind of subsurface engineering that the Cahokia builders performed was primarily additive, piling material up rather than cutting material away. The relationship between the additive underground engineering of earthwork construction and the subtractive underground engineering of tunnel construction is an interesting one that has not been fully explored. The knowledge and organizational capacity that produce one might be expected to overlap substantially with the knowledge and organizational capacity that produce the other, and the possibility that the same traditions that built the great earthworks of eastern North America were also building underground tunnel networks is one that the Cahokia comparison makes more plausible rather than less. The river itself, the Mississippi and its tributaries, deserves attention in this context. The rivers of the Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley and Mississippi system were the primary highways of the Hopewell Exchange Network, the routes along which heavy goods like copper masses and galena could be moved efficiently over long distances. The geography of the tunnel network anomalies, when you plot them on a map and look at their relationship to the river system, is not random. The sites where the most significant anomalies have been found tend to cluster in areas that were also nodes in the river-based exchange network, places where multiple river routes converged, or where portages between different watershed systems would have concentrated movement. This is the pattern you would expect if the underground infrastructure was part of the same system as the above-ground river-based exchange infrastructure, positioned to provide access to underground resources at the same locations where the above-ground exchange was concentrated. The portage points are particularly interesting in this regard. Portages, the overland carries between navigable waterways that allowed canoes and their contents to cross from one watershed to another, were among the most strategically important locations in the pre-Columbian transportation network of the Great Lakes region. Control of a key portage meant influence over the goods and people moving through it, and the archaeological record shows that portage points were typically associated with significant above-ground activity, earthwork features, midden deposits, evidence of repeated occupation over long periods. If the underground engineering tradition was positioning its works in relation to these strategically important locations, the convergence of underground infrastructure and above-ground exchange nodes would have created hubs of activity that were significant in both dimensions simultaneously, places where the surface world and the underground world intersected in a way that would have given them particular intensity in the economic and ceremonial life of the region. This is speculative, but it is the kind of speculation that the geographic pattern of the scan data invites. The data does not prove that the underground works were positioned in relation to portage points, but when you look at the map of anomaly sites, alongside the map of known Hopewell exchange nodes and portage locations, the overlap is notable enough to be worth investigating explicitly in the next phase of the research. Whether the overlap is as systematic as the preliminary impression suggests, and whether it reflects deliberate positioning of underground works in relation to exchange network geography, are questions that more careful spatial analysis of the combined datasets can begin to address. The investigation of America's oldest mines and the tunnel networks beneath them is, at its deepest level, an investigation into the geography of knowledge. Where was the knowledge of underground mineral resources located in pre-Columbian North America? Who held it? How was it transmitted? And how did its geographic distribution shape the organization of the societies that depended on the resources it gave access to? These are questions that connect the tunnel network hypothesis to the broader field of historical geography and to the growing recognition, in that field, that the pre-Columbian landscape of North America was not a wilderness waiting to be discovered, but a deeply inhabited and deeply known territory, whose geography was understood in ways that the subsequent history of the continent has largely obscured. The geographic knowledge of underground mineral resource locations was a form of power in pre-Columbian North America, and power, in that context as in all others, was unevenly distributed. The people who knew where the copper was and how to get at it had something that people who did not know that did not have, and that something gave them a particular kind of position in the exchange relationships that constituted the Hopewell system and its predecessors and successors. Understanding that positional geography of underground knowledge is part of understanding the social organization of the pre-Columbian Great Lakes and Ohio River Valley in a way that the surface-focused archaeology alone cannot provide. We are all, in a sense, living on top of knowledge that we do not have access to and do not know to ask about. The landscape we inhabit is full of the traces of what people before us did and knew and built and organized, and most of those traces are invisible to us either because they are underground or because we lack the frameworks to recognize them in what we can see on the surface. The tunnel network investigation is a particularly stark example of this general condition, a case where genuinely significant human works have been sitting inaccessibly underground for 2,000 years or more, unknown to the dominant historical account, preserved in fragmentary form in traditions that the dominant account has not taken seriously enough to consult. But the general condition is universal. We live on the surface of a history that goes much deeper than the surface, and most of us navigate that history with the light of a very limited lamp. The scans are extending the reach of the lamp into the underground, They are making visible what was not visible before. They are not resolving the mystery, but they are revealing that the mystery is larger and more interesting and more consequential than the accounts that had access only to the surface gave any reason to expect. This is the gift that the investigation offers, not answers but better questions, not resolution but a richer understanding of what is unresolved and why it matters to resolve it. Not the end of the story but a deeper engagement with the story, one that includes dimensions the earlier telling had missed. And that changes the character of the narrative in ways that cannot be undone by going back to the simpler version. The simpler version, the one that says that the history of mining in the Lake Superior region began in the mid-19th century and that the pre-Columbian peoples of eastern North America, while impressive in their earthwork construction and their long-distance exchange networks, did not practice underground engineering at significant scale, is not available anymore. Not for the people who have seen the scan data, not for the researchers who are working with the oral traditions, not for the indigenous community members who have been told their whole lives that the knowledge of what their ancestors did in this landscape was less extensive and less impressive than what the evidence now suggests it actually was. The simpler version has been replaced by a more complicated one, and the more complicated one, for all the work it requires and all the uncertainty it involves, is closer to what actually happened. What actually happened in this corner of North America over the span of several thousand years before European contact includes an organized tradition of underground mineral extraction that served the raw material needs of one of the most extensive ceremonial exchange networks in the pre-Columbian Western Hemisphere. It includes people who knew the underground world of the Lake Superior Basin and the Appalachian mineral country with a precision and a depth of knowledge that made them indispensable to the functioning of that network. It includes tunnel passages cut into the basalt and the limestone and the mica-bearing pegmatite of the region, passages that serve practical extraction purposes and cosmological purposes simultaneously, passages that connected the surface world to the underground resources on which the prosperity and the ceremonial life of the communities of the region depended. And it includes, preserved in the rock where the people who built the passages left it, a record of that activity that has survived the 2,000 years since the Hopewell decline and the disruptions of the colonial period, and the physical transformation of the landscape by industrial mining, waiting to be found by the tools that are only now becoming capable of finding it. That is what the scans found beneath America's oldest mines. Not just a tunnel network, a story, an old story, longer and deeper and more interesting than the one that had been told before. And the telling of that story, the work of recovering and understanding and contextualizing what the scans are showing, is the work that the investigation has set itself to do. It will take years. It will be complicated. It will produce results that surprise the people doing the work, as genuine investigation always does. But it will also produce knowledge that matters. Knowledge about who was here and what they did, and how sophisticated and sustained and geographically extensive their engagement with this land actually was. Knowledge that belongs in the account of this continent's history, and that the account will be richer and more accurate for including. The night is deep, the ground is all around, and somewhere in it, in the dark beneath the old mines and the earthworks and the quarries and the portage points of a continent-wide exchange network that was old before anyone now living was born, the tunnels persist, cut into the rock by people who knew what they were doing, holding the record of what they did, waiting for the morning when the investigation finds them and the story they tell can finally be added to the account that has been incomplete for too long. The waiting is almost over. Not quite, but almost. And the almost is enough, tonight, to carry you down into the dark where all the old stories go, the ones that were true long before anyone thought to write them down, the ones that the rock holds and the traditions hold and the land holds, the ones that are still being told in the languages of geology and archaeology and oral memory, all at once, all saying the same thing in different registers to anyone patient enough and quiet enough and present enough to hear it. The rock holds, the knowledge persists, the investigation continues, rest now and let it. There is one more thing worth saying before the night closes in entirely. One more thread to follow before the dark takes over and the mind lets go of the waking world. It concerns the way that this particular investigation connects to a broader rethinking that is happening right now, in this moment, in the discipline of North American archaeology and in the broader cultural conversation about the pre-Columbian past. We are living in what may turn out to be a pivotal moment in how the story of this continent before European contact is understood, not only by specialists but by the public, whose collective understanding of the past shapes how the present is navigated. The past generation of archaeological work in North America has produced a succession of findings that have systematically revised upward the scale, the complexity, and the geographic extent of pre-Columbian human activity. The documentation of the full extent of Amazonian earthworks and managed landscapes in South America, the demonstration that the Amazon basin was far more densely populated and far more intensively managed before European contact than the post-contact collapse of indigenous populations made it appear. The realization that the great forest of the Amazon was in significant part a cultural artifact, shaped by thousands of years of human plant management rather than a purely natural ecosystem. These findings have been transformative for understanding South American pre-contact history, and they have also had the effect of raising questions about what comparable investigation might reveal in North America, where similar assumptions about the character and extent of pre-Columbian landscape modification have not yet been as thoroughly challenged. The tunnel network investigation is part of the North American version of this broader rethinking. It is suggesting, as the Amazon research has suggested in a different context, that the underground dimension of pre-Columbian landscape modification was more extensive and more organized than the surface record alone suggested, and that understanding the full character of what pre-Columbian peoples were doing in this landscape requires looking below the surface as well as at it. This is a methodological insight as much as a substantive one, a recognition that the tools and the questions that archaeology has traditionally brought to bear on pre-Columbian North America have systematically missed a dimension of the story, and that correcting that methodological blind spot is as important as any specific finding the correction produces. The blind spot is correctable. That is the hopeful dimension of the current moment. The tools exist. The intellectual frameworks for understanding pre-Columbian complexity without the distortions of earlier assumptions are being developed. The collaborative relationships between researchers and indigenous communities, while still imperfect in many respects, are becoming more genuine and more productive than they have historically been. The institutional support for challenging the conventional accounts, while still not as robust as the evidence-based case for revision deserves, is growing. The conditions for the kind of transformative investigation that the tunnel network hypothesis points toward are more favorable now than they have ever been, and the preliminary work that has been done has established that the investment of serious research resources in this question is likely to produce results proportionate to that investment. What those results will look like in 10 or 20 years, when the investigation has had time to move from the preliminary scan data and the initial drilling and sampling to the full documentation and analysis of whatever can be directly accessed in the underground features, is impossible to predict with any specificity. Genuine investigation of genuinely unknown territory does not unfold on a predictable schedule, and the history of archaeological discovery is full of cases where the actual findings were both more and less than what the preliminary evidence suggested. But the direction of the preliminary findings, the consistency of the pattern across multiple sites and multiple lines of evidence, is enough to establish that the investment will not be wasted. Something is down there. What it is, specifically, and what it means for the broader account of pre-Columbian North American history will be determined by the work that remains to be done. And that work, the careful, collaborative, methodologically rigorous work of investigating the tunnel networks beneath America's oldest mines, is one of the more genuinely important archaeological research programs underway in North America at this moment, whether or not it has yet received the recognition that its potential significance deserves. The scans found the tunnels. The tunnels hold the story. The story is worth pursuing. And the pursuit, which has been the subject of this long night's conversation, is itself a form of the same impulse that sent people underground 3,000 years ago with copper chisels and stone lamps, and the accumulated knowledge of generations of underground engagement with the rock of this continent. The impulse to know what is there, to go below the surface and find what the surface conceals, to bring back from the underground world something that the world above can use. The tools have changed. The purposes have changed. The social frameworks within which the knowledge is pursued and held and applied have changed. But the impulse is the same, as old as the first person who looked at a hillside and wondered what was inside it and decided to find out. We are all, still, finding out. The investigation continues. And the rock, as always, holds what the investigation is looking for, waiting for us to find the right way to ask for it. There are people alive today who carry in their memories specific details about the underground spaces beneath the old mining territories of the Great Lakes region. Not many people. Not people who are eager to share everything they know with researchers they have just met, or with a world whose historical relationship to their community's knowledge has more often involved extraction than reciprocity. But people who know things, who are told things by elders who are told things by elders before them, in a chain of transmission that goes back farther than any of the documentary sources that the standard account of this region's history draws on. These people are not artifacts of the past. They are living participants in a present that includes, among other things, the tunnel network investigation and the questions it is raising, and the potential it holds for changing how the broader culture understands what their ancestors accomplished in this landscape. Their participation in the investigation, where it has been possible to arrange it in a genuinely reciprocal rather than simply extractive way, has been one of the most productive sources of insight the investigation has generated. Not because the knowledge they hold resolves the scientific questions directly, but because it provides a framework for understanding what the scientific findings might mean, a context within which the tunnel network evidence becomes legible in a way it cannot be from the scanned data alone. The science tells you that something is there. The knowledge of the people whose ancestors made it tells you, in fragments and in approximate terms, something about what it was for and how it was used. The combination of those two kinds of understanding is more powerful than either alone, and the investigation that honors both is the one most likely to produce results that are accurate and meaningful. This is the model that the best work in pre-Columbian North American archaeology is moving toward. Slowly and with all the friction that changes of deep institutional practice involve. The tunnel network investigation represents, in its collaborative dimensions, a version of that model at an early stage of implementation, still working out the practical details of how to conduct genuinely reciprocal research in a context where the power relations between the parties are historically unequal and where the stakes for the communities involved are different from the stakes for the researchers. The working out of those details is as important as any specific scientific finding, because it establishes the framework within which the knowledge that the investigation generates will be held and used, and that framework will determine whether the knowledge serves the communities whose heritage it concerns, or whether it is simply extracted from those communities and added to an academic literature that those communities have no particular reason to trust. The stakes are high enough, and the potential for this investigation to either serve or harm the interests of the indigenous communities most directly involved is real enough, that the ethical dimension of the work deserves as much attention as the scientific dimension. The tunnel network investigation is not simply a scientific question about what is in the rock. It is a question about history, and history has power, and who controls the telling of a history has power over the people whose past that history represents. Getting the science right matters enormously. Getting the ethics right matters just as much. And the researchers who are most deeply engaged with this investigation understand this, even when the institutional pressures they work under push toward treating the scientific question as primary and the ethical questions as secondary. The most important contributions of this investigation may ultimately be not the specific findings about what is underground, but the practices of collaborative, community-centered research that the investigation is developing, and that could serve as a model for future work in pre-Columbian archaeology more broadly. The night holds all of this. The scan data and the oral traditions and the drilling results and the archival research and the community consultations and the peer review processes and the institutional negotiations and the gradual, contested, difficult, necessary revision of the standard account that all of this work is contributing to. The night holds it all, and the rock holds what the night's investigation is looking for. And the people whose ancestors worked the rock hold what the scan data cannot tell. And together, patiently and with genuine commitment to understanding something real about this continent's deep past, the investigation moves forward. One more night, one more conversation about what is down there and what it means. One more step in the long walk toward a more complete and more honest account of who was here and what they did and how far their knowledge and their works reached into the world that subsequent generations inherited from them without fully recognizing the inheritance. The inheritance is real, the works are real, the knowledge is real, and the investigation that is bringing them back into view is one of the more important things happening in North American scholarship right now. Remember that as the night takes you. The ground beneath you has a history that goes deeper than anything you were taught. The people who made that history are still present in their descendants and their traditions. The investigation is the beginning of a more honest reckoning with all of it.